Tonight's topic is intelligent design science? Our first speaker is Dr. Ray Bohlin, Vice President of Vision Outreach with Probe Ministries. Dr. Bohlin was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, and is a graduate of the University of Illinois with a BS in Zoology, the University of North Texas with an MS in Population Genetics, and the University of Texas at Dallas with an MS PhD in Molecular and Cell Biology. He's been with Probe Ministries since 1975 and has lectured and debated on dozens of college and university campuses. He has addressed issues in the creation evolution debate, as well as other science-related issues such as the environment, genetic engineering, medical ethics, and sexually transmitted diseases. Dr. Bohlin was named a Research Fellow of the Discovery Institute's Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture in 1997, 2000, and 2012. He and his wife, Sue, who is here. Sue is an associate speaker and web mistress for Probe Ministries, as well as a professional calligrapher and Christian speaker. They live in Plano. They have 2 grown sons. Making his inaugural debut to the Bible Beer Consortium, please welcome a man that I have read since 1993 during my first year of seminary, when many of you were addicted to Similac, Dr. Ray Bohlin.
There we go. Everybody can hear fine, I presume. And I'm going to turn my little timer on. As you might expect, I tend to go over, so I need a little reminder. Well, the question, is intelligent design science, is a very broad and all-encompassing question. People have written chapters of books and even entire books really devoted to the process, to this question. And so we're really going to be skimming the surface a little bit here tonight. And at times, I expect, since I have to discuss what science is, as well as what intelligent design is, to be able to answer that question, there might be a few places where it might get some rough water for you. I will be doing my best to explain things as clearly as I can. But you need to understand that sometimes this gets a little philosophical as well as scientifically in-depth. So if you want, I'm always very free with my PowerPoint presentations. If you would like a copy of it, my wife is back there in the blue shawl and the silver hair. And she'll take your information. We can make an arrangement to get a copy of this to you. So, what do we do? Well, first of all, what is science? Well, surprisingly, there really is no real clear-cut answer to that question. Science is a lot of different things depending upon the field of science you happen to be involved in. In fact, philosophers of science have been struggling over this over the last several decades, and they're finding it difficult. You really can't find a single all-encompassing definition of what science technically is. So, anecdotally, I've heard that one philosopher of science walking down the hallway with somebody else, he was asked, "What's science?" She says, well, science is what scientists do. If that doesn't help you at all, I understand completely. But that just kind of illustrates the difficulty that we do have in trying to define simply what science is. Really, we no longer use any list of statements that try to define what science is. Often this is called demarcation. In other words, what demarcates science from other forms of learning or investigation. And sometimes this is simply called the demarcation problem. And the reason this has become a problem, because scientists in different fields will utilize very different methods of how they approach their particular science. So for some, there's a diversity of methods, as I said. Some scientists perform laboratory experiments. Some don't ever walk inside a laboratory. Some will try to explain repeatable phenomena by reference to natural law. Some explore unique past events by reference to observable present causes. Some test their theories by actually making predictions. Some test their theories by assessing their explanatory power. And there's a longer list here, but I just wanted to give you some idea that this is not necessarily a very easy question to answer. I am going to try, however, to define how I think intelligent design fits within one realm of how scientists operate. So, if we're still asking this question, what is science? You've probably, in your high school education somewhere, you've run across a fairly standard description of the scientific method. Basically, you make an observation, you form a hypothesis about how to try to explain what you've observed, you design an experiment to test that hypothesis, and as you begin to gather results you get a conclusion, whether positive or negative, and as you continue those experiments, you can end up perhaps establishing some sort of regularity or even natural law. That very well describes what many have done in physics and chemistry. We have established scientific laws, laws of chemistry, laws of physics, by this kind of approach. But some fields of science today really can't focus and perform their science in this rather limited way. Really what this is called, this is inductive reasoning, okay? Establishing a particular principle from fairly repeated observations. You see things, you test things this way, that way, you keep accumulating those results, and eventually you might be able to make a fairly authoritative statement about what you've been researching and what you've been looking into. In talking about inductive reasoning, it's the type we often subscribe to science, but it's not the only form of scientific reasoning. Some have called this the bottom up. You take lots of observations of things you can readily see and observe, and you form larger conclusions on the top. For instance, I give you this example here. Every time I approach this dog, it's never bitten me. After repeated experiments or observation of this, you might say, next time I approach this dog, it will not bite me. And if I were to use my particular dog, Baylor, who is a golden retriever, golden retrievers don't bite anything except their food. So I can say Baylor has never bitten me, he's never bitten anyone in our family, he's never bitten a stranger who walks inside the door, he's never bitten a stranger we've run across on our morning walks. I can fairly confidently say that I could draw a general principle from all those observations that Baylor will never bite anyone. Yeah, I'd like to think that's fairly accurate, but you can see from numerous kinds of observations in different settings, in different contexts, I keep getting the same results, so I can establish a fairly general pattern. That's what we call inductive reasoning, and that's how we tend to think most scientists operate. But there's another form of logical reasoning called deductive reasoning, and this is when we apply a general law that we've probably arrived at through inductive reasoning, but then we start making these general statements to make a very specific observation or declaration. Socrates is the one who famously put it this way, all men are mortal. Well, how would you know all men are mortal except by observing lots of people die? You start seeing, this is getting to be 100%. All people die, so all men, of course all men and women, are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates, that individual, is also mortal. So you've started with a general principle, and you've narrowed it down to a specific type of conclusion. Scientists will often argue that way as well. But there's another form of reasoning that some scientists use in particular scientific disciplines, and that's what I like to call historical sciences, and they use what is known as abductive reasoning. Now, let me just say, first of all, I forgot to mention this. I made the font as big as I could once I got here and I realized how small the screen was. So if you're able to follow along, great. If you can read it, great. Otherwise, I'll be talking my way through all of these. The historical sciences use what's called abductive reasoning. In other words, they observe facts, they observe the results of events, and then try to explain those past by using a past event that would leave those kinds of results behind. For instance, a geologist might observe that there's a layer of volcanic ash between two particular rock layers. Volcanic ash seems to only result from a volcanic eruption. Therefore, a volcanic eruption caused this layer of volcanic ash sometime in the past. This is the type of scientific reasoning that intelligent design applies. It falls under this level of scientific reasoning, so when searching, say, to explain the origin of certain observations in the present, the information content in DNA, we can reasonably ask, how did this chemical molecule come to contain meaningful information? Well, an intelligent cause, as I'll define more directly later, is the only known cause in the present capable of producing this kind of result. Stephen Meyer, in his book Signature in the Cell, referred to this as the inference to the best explanation. In other words, when you're doing historical sciences, you might be able to come up with a couple of explanations that could explain what you've seen. Steve, in the book Signature in the Cell, he uses the example of he wakes up after a nap and his car and his driveway are completely wet. There could be a couple of ways to explain that. Perhaps it rained. That's one possibility. Another possibility is, well, the automatic sprinkler system came on, and so his car and driveway are wet. Another one that potentially is correct is that someone with a hose kind of hosed down the driveway in the car, and that's why it appears wet. So all three explanations, based upon what I've told you so far, could explain the phenomenon that somehow happened in the past. Let's say he goes outside then, and he observes, however, that the street is dry, and the sidewalk and grass across the street, on the homes across the street, they're all dry. All right, it's not likely that a rain cloud comes right over the driveway in the car and only rains there. That's probably not a good explanation. But so it could still be the hose or the sprinkler system. But as he goes out and kind of looks further, only the driveway is wet. The sidewalk leading up to the front of the house and the sidewalk in front of the house, none of those are wet. That kind of rules out the sprinkler system. And as he walks closer to the car in the driveway, he observes a pail with a sponge and soapy water in it. Most likely somebody was washing the car. So he saw the effects of a past event. His car and driveway are wet. A couple of things could possibly explain that, but then he searches for other pieces of information to try to narrow down the possibilities. And that's the kind of reasoning that they do in the historical sciences all the time. Now, William Dembski, in his book, The Design Inference, published by the Cambridge University Press, 1998, came up with something he called the explanatory filter, where certain events from the past in particular that you've observed or you see the effects of those events, you can narrow those down into three particular categories. With this event, is it something that's highly probable? In other words, is this likely to happen? The law of gravity says that any two objects that have mass will be attracted to each other. Well, if I had a ball and I threw the ball up, it wouldn't keep going up, would it? It would fall because of gravity. And that's a very high probable event. I don't know how many times you've tried to toss a ball up and just see it keep going up and up and up, but I'll bet that's never happened. So that would be something you could attribute to regularity. There's probably some natural law or natural process that's very observable, repeatable, that would explain that kind of event. But let's say now you have an event that's taken place that isn't quite so probable, and he uses the possibility of you're just flipping coins. So you got a quarter and you're just flipping quarters to see whether heads or tails. And you might flip that coin 100 times. Well, you understand the probability is going to tell you that you're going to get somewhere around 50% heads and 50% tails, but the actual number might come out to be 53 heads and 47 tails. That's expected according to probability. Every time you do it 100 times, you're going to get perhaps a slightly different number. That's what he would call an intermediate probability. In other words, that can be attributed to chance. However, if you flip the coin 100 times and 100 times it came up heads, now statistically that's probable, but you'd probably suspect something's a little funny with that. Well, the next kind of event, is it regularity? Is it due to chance? And maybe you've come up with something that has an extremely small probability. This type of thing isn't likely to happen just by chance. Then he says, then design becomes at least a possibility. And what kind of information do you need to demonstrate that indeed, there you go, halfway through. Could design be the proper answer? Well, what you have to look for, he says, is you have to look for some specificity to this highly improbable event. In other words, does it mean something? Is there some practical application to it? Can we, as I said, derive some sort of meaning to it? And if it is highly specified, then he indicates that design would become the logical choice. And so you have the inference to the best explanation. You have Bill Dembski's the explanatory filter, a process you can go through where you're examining the empirical evidence to see are there sufficient clues to conclude that intelligent design is a good choice or maybe even the only choice. So now I've talked a little bit about science and how different sciences do things. By the way, archaeologists use intelligent design all the time. They're digging in a bunch of rocks and sand and dirt, and they find pieces. Okay, is this just a rock caused by natural causes, or is this a small piece of pottery that was designed by a human? They use the design inference. They use that explanatory filter. Is this highly probable? No. Is this intermediate probable? Is it due to chance? Probably not. Oh, I think somebody made this. So we use it there. The SETI project, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, is monitoring radio signals that come to us from all directions from space. Most of them are naturally caused. There's no pattern, there's no inherent meaning to any of them, but they're searching for radio signals that might actually contain meaningful information that they can conclude could have come from an intelligence. That's using the inference to best explanation. That's using the concepts of intelligent design. Well, I want to make something clear from the start. Intelligent design is not the latest version of creationism. Creationism always begins with some interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11, and from that interpretation that explores the scientific evidence for corroboration for that particular theological perspective. That's what creationism is. But intelligent design doesn't do that. Intelligent design doesn't require any biblical input. You simply look at the empirical evidence and do I detect the effects of an intelligent cause? And that's what the project of intelligent design is all about. So first of all, we could say there's a negative side to intelligent design. It's an intellectual movement that challenges Darwinism and its dependence on random, chaotic processes coupled with selection. In other words, what we're trying to say is that there are some observations we make in biological organisms that natural process simply cannot solve, cannot produce those kinds of effects. So the positive side is that it's also a scientific research program, and I've highlighted here, investigates the effects of intelligent causes. Well, what are the effects of intelligent causes? Well, we've come to highlight those with two possibilities, two aspects to it. There are effects of what we call high specificity coupled with extremely small probabilities. My famous example that I like to use again and again is winning the lottery. A highly improbable event, but somebody usually wins. So the odds of winning the lottery in California, for instance, I'm told, is 1 chance in about 23 million. So if you buy one ticket, your chance is 1 in 23 million, you'll win. But those who deal in probability and statistics will basically tell you that if you sell around 10 to 11 million tickets, someone is likely to win. You can't predict it certainly, but you have enough what they call probabilistic resources. You have 11 million possibilities for someone to guess the correct series of 6 numbers. And so you basically reduce the probability from 1 in 23 million to about 1 in 2 that somebody's going to win. But that's not terribly specific. People win the lottery all the time. It's a very improbable event, but there's nothing really specific about that. It's just somebody who happened to put down the 6 numbers. So we can see that indeed improbable events happen all the time, and it doesn't require any sort of design. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drastically lower the probability and dramatically raise the specificity of this result. Let's say you have a neighbor, that's specific to you at least, who's played the lottery every week from the beginning, now for a couple of decades, and never wins. But one day, your neighbor comes running and screaming out the front of his house, I won the lottery, I won the lottery. The guy's won $4 million. Now that's specific to you. You might actually have some personal benefits from this. I mean, you've been a good neighbor. And you've shared things back and forth. Well, you know, share and share alike, right? Maybe he'll at least fix the fence between your 2 properties and take care of some things that have been a point of contention for a while. But you know, if he produces the proper ticket that can be authenticated, this is no big deal to the Lottery Commission. It's a person who just happened to have the proper 6 numbers, and they award the prize. But now we're going to lower that probability even more and raise the specificity even higher. What about that your friend wins the lottery 3 weeks in a row and confides in you that he's used the same set of 6 numbers each time? What are you thinking? Go ahead, somebody's thinking something here. Somebody cheated. Somehow, but actually what you're suspecting is intelligent design. Somehow someone was able to intelligently manipulate the system to ensure that this person won with these set of numbers 3 weeks in a row. I guarantee you the Lottery Commission is going to investigate this, because when you start calculating that probability for the same person to win it 3 weeks in a row, each time they buy 1 ticket, it's got to be a Calvinist, right? Only need 1 ticket. If God wants me to win, 1 ticket's enough. The odds of that happening are 1 chance in 23 million times 1 chance in 23 million times 1 chance in 23 million. Or 1 chance in about 12 sextillion. Now, you don't even, what in the world is that kind of number? What does that really mean? Now, in order to have enough probabilistic resources for this to be probable by chance, you would need to sell about 6 sextillion tickets. What that means, if we assume there's, 7+ billion people on the earth, they would each have to buy approximately 1 trillion tickets. That is simply not possible. Yes, the Lottery Commission will investigate. Somehow the system has been intelligently designed, or guy cheated. Well, what we're looking for in nature are events like this. Yeah, they're improbable, but they are so improbable, and there is an extremely high specificity to it, that the only likely explanation is some form of intelligent design. Now, you've probably all seen this before. This is Mount Rushmore, right? And as you look at that, even if you've never been there, you've probably seen pictures of it. You realize those are the faces of Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln. But even if you didn't know who those people were, even if you've never seen pictures of them before, you would clearly recognize those are very discrete and discernible faces on the rock face. Now, you might be initially tempted to think that, well, that could have just happened through natural process, wind, rain, erosion, all kinds of stuff. But wait a minute, you see lots of other evidence here. First of all, the faces are all very much lightly colored compared to the surrounding rock. In other words, that surface has been recently exposed. You can see below it all the mess, all the pieces that have been carved out. You see a huge amount of what's called talus at the bottom underneath Mount Rushmore there. And also, you can go to any angle and look at those four faces from above, from below, from the left to the right, different perspectives, and you're always going to see those same faces. You recognize them immediately, and you're going to be able to conclude some intelligence was necessary to produce that. Now, at Mount Rushmore, they have lots of pictures showing you how they actually did it, so you can demonstrate that yourself. But eliminate all of that, and simply by looking at it, this is something pretty unique. Some intelligence was necessary for that. As opposed to Vermont, the old man on the mountain, which at a particular time of day, when the sky is light behind it and you see a dramatic shadow that's being cast, you can see the outline of the profile of a person. You see a strong forehead, a nose, a mouth, a really strong chin. I mean, granted, I don't know how much stronger chin you can get, right? And by the way, it's from 1806 to 2003, 1806 meaning that's when the first European happened to see it, and then 2003 is when the face fell off the mountain. So you can't go see the old man on the mountain anymore, he no longer exists. But you can only discern this profile from one direction at one time of day. If you go directly in front of it, you can't see any nose or mouth or chin. You go to the other side, you can't see it either. This would be something we could attribute to natural cause. There's nothing really specific about it. It kind of looks like the profile of a person, but nobody's going to suspect that this was carved out of the mountain by Native Americans 200 years ago. Now, let's talk about biological design specifically. We're going to start closing with this. I have a couple of comments from two very strong evolutionary scientists who would argue strongly against any kind of intelligent design. The first one is the famous British atheist Richard Dawkins. In the opening page of his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he makes an incredible statement. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Now, he spends the remaining 280-some pages trying to show you how it's not the result of design, how it is just the result of mutation, natural selection. But he recognizes up front that biological organisms seem to bear the imprint of design. And then there's Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, and he put it this way: biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Now, if you're having to continually tell yourself, okay, it's not designed, it evolved, that's telling me that for most biologists, when they simply look at the data, look at the information, see how cells operate, it looks designed. So you have not designed, not designed. Well, very simple statement. If it looks designed, maybe, just maybe, it is. Can we at least entertain the possibility within the realm of science? And of course, I think we can actually do that. So let's look at some aspects of what I would call design in the cell. We have artificial languages and decoding. With DNA, you have a code within DNA. That code is transcribed into another type of molecule called RNA, and the information in the RNA molecule is translated into protein. Transcribe, translate, those are language terms. We use them not because they're helpful or a good analogy, but they accurately describe what's going on inside the cell. We have memory banks, the chromosomes. They are the memory banks of your cells. They contain the necessary information, not all of it, but most of the necessary information for the cell to do what it needs to do. There is a very precise control of how things are assembled. It's a very automatic assembly. There's not much variation to it. It happens automatically. To program into any system that kind of automatic function requires a high level of programming. There's proofreading. When DNA is copied, sometimes it makes mistakes, where there's another set of proteins that comes behind, and when there's a mistake made, they fix it. So there's proofreading going on. So there's a quality control in place. Many proteins consist of numerous smaller polypeptides that all get pushed together into one big complex, and those are put together with prefabrication and what we call a modular construction. Again, I'm using design terms, I'm using construction terms because, again, this is accurately describing what goes on in the cell. There's also a complete replication system. Now, we've made some pretty complicated devices like this laptop here in front of me. Imagine if you gave the computer engineers one more qualification. Okay, I like how this computer operates. It does what I need to do. I really like all the different features of it. Could you design into it another feature that allows me to just add some raw materials and it'll make another copy of itself? I'm sorry. They're just going to say, you're crazy. We can't do that. But yet cells do that every day. They're doing it right now in your own bodies. And these are 1,000 times smaller than our best computers. Oop, got a little over a minute left. This is going to be tight. So, what I want you to look at here, this is from Hawaii, and in the background is a group of rocks. Very random association, but it's very, very complex. It's complex, but it's not specific. For those rocks to get into that very construction is a really small probability, but there it is. It happened. But there's nothing specific about it. It's just a bunch of rocks. You look in the foreground and you see what looks like a circle of rocks. You say, maybe that's because of intelligent design. You even seem to have a little entryway off to the left, and some boulders are bigger than others, so that's maybe where people sat. Maybe they had a meeting there. But you know, it's just not that many rocks. This might be something of intermediate probability, and maybe it is just because of chance. Let's say you go a little further down the beach, and you see this. John loves Mary. You know intuitively, this did not happen by natural process. Some person with a mind wrote these symbols in the sand to communicate a message. These are precise symbols, John, Loves. Can I get a little extra time, Ezra? Okay. You can have as much as you want, Zach. Okay. John, Loves, Mary. These symbols are then arranged in a sequence. They are grouped into what we call words, and the words are arranged in a sequence to communicate a message. Do you know if that message is true? No. Do you know who wrote it? No. Do you know how they did it? Not really. Could have used a stick, could have used a stone, could have used their big toe. A lot of different things could have done that. But from that evidence, you can't tell. But what you do know is it took a mind to produce that. That requires an intelligent cause. And with biological information, we have a similar situation. We string letters together to form words. We form words together to make sentences. We put sentences together to make paragraphs, chapters, and books. We put books together to make a library. Well, in your cells, with our chromosomes, we have a very similar correlation. We have the individual nucleotides that make up the DNA. We string nucleotides together to make what we call codons. Three nucleotides make a codon. Each codon codes for a specific amino acid and protein. You put codons together, and you get genes. You put amino acids together, you get proteins. You put genes and proteins together, and you get chromosomes. You put chromosomes together, you get a genome. Again, this is not just a helpful analogy. This accurately describes the arrangement of the information in DNA in each of your cells. What I maintain is that DNA informational code requires intelligent pre-program. We are completely unaware of any natural process that will form an informational code. But minds do it all the time. Stephen Meyer in his signature in the cell, I'm close with this. He gives you 6 ways in which intelligent design uses scientific reasoning. The case for ID, he says, is based on empirical evidence. As I indicated earlier, it requires no attachment to any interpretation of the Bible or any other holy book. Advocates of ID use fairly established scientific methods, particularly inference to the best explanation. It can be testable. If I'm saying that DNA requires intelligent pre-programming, that's a very testable concept. Just show me how natural process can give you a code. and I've been falsified. Case for ID exemplifies historical scientific reasoning, as I've demonstrated earlier. ID addresses a specific question in evolutionary biology, not just the origin of the information in DNA, but where does new information come from? How do we get new genes and new information to perform new processes and new structures in cells? And ID is supported by peer-reviewed scientific literature. If you go to the website for the Discovery Institute and you go for Center for Science and Culture, under that they have a tab for research, and under that tab you can download a 150-page document that's an annotated bibliography of the 100-plus articles in peer-reviewed literature that are promoting intelligent design. So there's lots of categories by which I can say intelligent design indeed is science. Thank you.
Our second speaker, this is your fourth debate? Fourth debate for the BBC. I think Zach and Matt Dillahunty are the only two who have had 4 debates. Zach is a very, very faithful and very supportive person that anytime I need a resource or someone that he would recommend to defend a position in a very studied and respectful way, I reach out to Zach, and he is always very, very happy to answer that. Speaking specifically to his, whoa, check, okay. Dr. Zachary Moore earned his PhD in pathobiology and molecular medicine at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine before his appointment as a research fellow in the Department of Molecular Genetics at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas. He's been published in peer-reviewed biomedical journals, including the Journal of Lipid Research and the American Journal of Pathology. He is currently a scientific consultant and medical writer for companies and institutions involved in clinical research, primarily in the field of oncology. For over a decade, his Evolution 101 podcast had provided more than 1 million listeners with a concise and accessible understanding of the science of evolutionary biology. Speaking to the topic is intelligent design science. Please welcome Dr. Zachary Moore.
Thank you, Ezra. It's a pleasure to be here for my 4th speaking engagement. And this is really, it's sort of ironic that they've sort of held me back for this one. This is probably the one for which I'm most qualified to speak about. So as Ezra was saying, yeah, I have this kind of interesting background. I have a degree in molecular biology. Actually, I think my credentials match Dr. Bohlin's exactly. I thought it was just so fantastic that we were able to come up here and chat about this issue. So, intelligent design. Is intelligent design science? Well, I could just let Dr. Bohlin have his day and sit down and say, yes, it is. But, of course, I'm up here to argue the opposite point. So I will say no, if that's okay with everybody. No, it is not science. To a large degree, this question has already been answered. This question is, outside of a very small but very vocal community, has already been answered. It's already a dead question for the most part. It's been answered by the scientific community. It's been answered by the legal community. And now it's actually being answered to an interesting degree by the Christian community as well. And the answer that they have is consistent: no. Intelligent design is not science. Now, I have a busy schedule this time of the year. I do a lot of traveling for different scientific conferences. As Ezra mentioned, I do some consulting. I'm supposed to be traveling to a conference in Chicago coming up next week, or later this week. And this is one of the biggest scientific conferences in the world. It's clinical research, translational research, the cutting edge stuff, helping patients. It's really fantastic to be part of it. But I was surprised a couple of years ago when I saw an abstract accepted for inclusion about Reiki. Does anybody know what Reiki is? If you know, flap your flag around. I like to poll my audience sometimes, so that's easy for me to see if it flaps. Okay, so we know what Reiki is. For those of you who don't know, Reiki is supposedly this Japanese belief that you can heal somebody by taking your hands and not placing them on the person, by holding your hands 10 to 15 centimeters above their body, not even making contact with their body. There was an abstract presented at a scientific conference claiming that Reiki was useful for helping patients with cancer. I looked online and I saw on the major clinical trials index, clinicaltrials.gov, there are no less than 8 clinical trials currently ongoing testing Reiki in patients. One of them actually being done in my hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio. It's actually the biggest clinical trial currently ongoing for Reiki. 250 patients who are being admitted to Cincinnati Children's Hospital for tonsillectomies. They're being randomized to receive either Reiki treatment or just somebody standing over them going like this treatment, or just standard post-surgical treatment. Anyway, that's ongoing. I'll let you all know when the paper is published. There was a study that was claimed to have happened in Turkey a couple years ago. As far as I haven't yet seen a paper from this, but I've seen a report. And they claimed that they did distant Reiki. So their Reiki master in Turkey was so good that he was actually set up in his house 8 kilometers away from the hospital, and they would just feed him the names of the patients, and he would just sort of put his hands like this, and the energy would come out of his hands and heal the patient. And they claimed that there was a very small but a statistically significant effect from the Reiki this guy did. Now, raise your flag and wave around if you think that that's science. No? Now, it's interesting to point out that what they're doing with Reiki meets every single one of the criteria that Dr. Bohlin just mentioned that Stephen Meyer puts forward in his book, Signature in the Cell. They're following the scientific method, they're doing empiricism, they're asking good questions, they're postulating falsifiable hypotheses, it looks like they're doing science. But nothing about the mechanism they propose is consistent with anything that we know about the way the human body works. Recently, there was a physician named Andrew Wakefield, based out of the United Kingdom. And he was a physician scientist of sorts. And he did a study that was actually published in The Lancet, which is a very prestigious, peer-reviewed journal, published in the United Kingdom, in which he showed that little children who were given the MMR vaccine developed autism at higher than normal rates. And based on that paper, there has been an enormous community-level response, a grassroots response to his research, and has caused lots of people all over, not just the UK, but also in the United States and elsewhere in the world, to stop vaccinating their children because of this. Now, Wakefield's research was recently shown to be completely fraudulent. Now, it just so happens that Dr. Wakefield, as he was publishing this paper, was developing his own alternative treatment for measles, mumps, and rubella that he was about to commercialize. I'm sure that's just a complete coincidence, that he had some biased reason to promote that sort of research. His research has been shown to be fraudulent. The Lancet published a retraction. In the United Kingdom, he lost his license. He is no longer allowed to be a physician. But guess where Dr. Wakefield is right now? He continues to promote his anti-vaccine agenda in the very heart of Texas, in Austin. And he maintains a small but vocal contingent of people who insist that what he's doing is good science. Now, this may be a little bit more controversial in this room, but wave your hand if you think Dr. Wakefield represents good science. And yet he meets every single one of the criteria that Stephen Meyer put forward in Signature in the Cell. Which brings us to the issue tonight. These organizations, Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, and the Discovery Institute, these organizations also have a small but vocal following. And they, very similarly to Dr. Wakefield, very similar to these Reiki practitioners, they attempt to use scientific respectability to further certain ends that they value. So what exactly are they doing? This creationism, intelligent design, whatever this is. What is going on here? Why are they doing what they're doing? Why, if I'm right and this question has already been answered, if this is a dead question, why are these organizations still around? And they are, right? So Answers to Genesis just built this huge Noah's Ark park in Kentucky. Institute for Creation Research is now here in Irving. And Discovery Institute is still going reasonably strong. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Yeah, reasonably strong. So why? Well, in order to understand why these organizations exist, we have to first understand the story of how they came to be. And especially the one organization that's pushing the intelligent design message today, which is the Discovery Institute. But first, a love story. Or should I say a bug story? So this is a story about how I came to be in love with science. I was 5 years old in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, Cincinnati is unique for a lot of different reasons, and some of you may be Cincinnati lovers, some of you may be Cincinnati haters. One of the things that is sort of a love-hate thing with Cincinnati is the cicadas. Cincinnati is home to Brood 5, one of these recurring broods of cicadas that just comes and swarms and just makes everyone's lives miserable for an entire summer. Now, we have cicadas here in Texas. We do not have Cincinnati cicadas. We do not have these little black monstrosities. We have like the big green dumb cicadas that sort of fly around and bang into things. We do not have these things. These come out by the millions, by the tens of millions, and they are all over everywhere. Well, in 1985, Brood 8 came out. I was 5 years old, and I was fascinated. I saw these cicadas everywhere I looked. They were on every building, they were on every car, they were on every tree. The sound that they made was deafening. And I noticed something. I was only 5 years old, but I noticed something. I saw that there's almost all these cicadas were these little black, nasty looking things. But every so often I would see one of these white cicadas. And I thought, that's really odd. What is that? What's going on here? Why are there these white cicadas and also black cicadas? I wonder if the white ones are different in some way. Maybe the whites are the females and the blacks are the males, but that doesn't make any sense because there's hardly any whites that I see and lots of blacks. I didn't understand what was going on, but I was curious. I didn't know what the answer was, but I wanted to know. It just so happened my father gave me a bug box earlier that summer. So I snuck up on one of these little white bastards and I captured him. I put him on my bug box, and I sat and I waited. And lo and behold, the white one turned into the black one. All the white ones were just right out of their shell. They were just newly erupted nymphs. They just needed to dry out. And once they dried out, they turned black and ugly and nasty, and they started making noise. I found this fascinating. This was my sort of scientific awakening. I had seen something in my environment that I couldn't understand, and I asked a question. I wanted to know why. I wanted to know what was going on there. I didn't have any preconceived notions. I had no idea. I just wanted to see what would happen. And so I did. And so that's how I learned the story of the white cicadas in Cincinnati. And I of course, my mind was awakened to a lot of other scientific inquiry. As lots of little kids do, I got interested in dinosaurs. Started reading up everything I could about dinosaurs. But when I was 11 years old, I was enrolled. My parents were going to this church. It was a new church that we had sort of previously gone to. Long story. Anyway, they stuck me in this Sunday school class that was being taught by the father of some of the other kids who were in the class, who were way older than me. They were both in middle school. And the father was this very serious guy. And he only gave very serious lectures. He was British. Try to imagine, I don't know if anybody knows, but try to imagine if you were sending your kids to a Sunday school that was taught by J.I. Packer. That's pretty much what I went through. And don't get me wrong, I loved it. It was fascinating. I'd never been exposed to anything like that. I'm taking college-style notes and trying to keep up and trying to follow along with everything that's going on. Anyway, one Sunday, there was a lecture about the devil, about Satan. about sort of his characteristics, his goals, what we can learn from him from the Bible, etc. And I remember very specifically that lecture really unlocking something in my head, because I was starting to learn more about dinosaurs and paleontology, and I was also very familiar with the Bible. I was reading the Bible very often as a young kid. And I had some nascent understanding that what I was sort of learning about paleontology didn't exactly fit with like Genesis 1 and 2, like Dr. Bohlin had mentioned. And I remember walking back to our car after church was over, and I looked at my father and I said, I wonder, Dad, do you think maybe Satan had anything to do with any of these dinosaur fossils, or do you think this is like a big trick being played on us or something? And I know this is a kind of a common like objection or something that gets said. I had never heard this before. I was a very sheltered child, so I take all the blame for coming up with that in my own little twisted head. But I sort of posed that just to my dad. We were sort of walking side by side, and I sort of looked up at him, and I said, what do you think? And he didn't say anything. He just kind of looked down at me and very visibly rolled his eyes and turned back the other way. And in that instant, I knew that was not the right question to be asking. That was not going to go down any productive, profitable path with regard to my theology. And at that point, I don't ever recall ever attempting to apply the theology that I was using to reinterpret and reevaluate the science that I was also exploring separately. For me, that was never an issue, right? And as I matured in both my faith and also my life, I began to understand that this was not the case for most of the Christians I was interacting with. Right? So a lot of my Christian friends, a lot of my schoolmates did not have quite the similar respect for God's sovereignty that I had, in part because of the way that I was brought up. They sort of had this idea that God would intervene whenever it was necessary, whenever they needed him to do something for them. If he needed them to help them study for a math test, he would intervene in that way. Right? This was the God who would just sort of blink and make your life better, right? And so I came to understand that a lot of these also thought that, well, if God can do that, if he can blink and make your life better, why can't he blink and bring a new creature into existence? Why can't he blink and introduce a new chromosome into an organism if he needs to? Why can't he blink and cause a speciation event? Right? That God can do anything. But the God that I understood was the creator of the cosmos, and that meant something, right? To be that big, to be that powerful, to be that much in charge of the whole picture. That God was no genie who would meddle with the affairs of men, who would act on a whim to make some small thing happen. And certainly would not be fine-tuning the cosmos like some mechanic tuning up a car. I eventually encountered Darwin's ideas themselves for the first time about the same time I graduated high school. I can't remember why I got a paperback on the origin of the species, but I did, and I read it, and I found it fascinating. And I started to understand those ideas a little bit more formally for the first time, and they made perfect sense to me, right? So you look at the world, you look at the way organisms exist, you look at the way that the different clades of animals are organized, how different things are related to each other. I'd spent years. Remember those little cards that they used to send in, those green plastic boxes that had every species known to man in them? They had all the little facts on the back. I got all of those. I was memorizing all sorts of animals left and right. And once I understood evolution, everything made sense, right? It was an intuitively beautiful process that brought about, as Darwin himself said, endless forms most beautiful. Right? And I entered college and started studying biology formally. And they say Christians send their kids to college to lose their faith. I don't know if my parents were really worried about that. That didn't really happen to me. My apostasy did start towards the end of my college life, but it had nothing to do with science. I I can certainly attest it had everything, this is just an aside, it had everything to do with the Bible. So science was a fascinating process, and everything that I was learning about as a student studying biology in college, I recognized and I appreciated how central evolution was to all of that. I began to appreciate it as a conceptual framework, uniting everything that I was learning, an underlying foundation for everything that the cosmos was teaching us about life. And I recall the quote by Theodosius Dobzhansky, who is a professing Christian, of course. He wrote an article in 1973 called "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." And as a professing Christian, I agreed with them, of course. Of course. And I entered into graduate school. I began to study more in depth the molecular world inside each one of our cells. And the evidence of evolutionary change became even more compelling. And I have an entirely other lecture that I can give on that subject that's really not relevant here because I'm not making a case for evolution. I'm just sort of describing my own history. But I got involved in the laboratory doing research and under expert guidance that was provided to me from several very excellent scientific mentors. I began to learn how to ask the right questions, how to design tests that could evaluate those questions, and this is important, how to contribute to the field even if the answers to the questions I was asking were not the ones that I was anticipating, right? And this is the absolute bedrock fundamental lesson that I learned as a young scientist. And this is not something that anybody sits down and teaches you, right? It's not in a book. You don't get a little booklet when you start a science education that says, this is how you be a scientist, right? As Dr. Bohlin was saying, it's kind of a fuzzy thing, hard to describe. Philosophers of science may have different appraisals of how that might be done. There are certain qualities that are consistent with how science operates, falsifiability being one. But the main one for me, this is what was drummed into me by all my mentors. Do not bring your do not bring your biases to the bench. Do not bring your biases to the bench. The one thing that science does, and it doesn't do it perfectly, certainly, but it does it better than anything else that we've ever developed. And this is the value of science. Science is a systematic tool to reduce our biases. If we come into the experiment with an idea predetermined about how things are going to go, if there's a certain way that we want things to go, science will stop us. And if it doesn't stop you, then you're doing bad science. If your peers try to replicate your experiments and they show that you're wrong and you don't back down, you're doing bad science. If you publish, you can even publish, right? So there's publications about Reiki that I mentioned. Dr. Wakefield published. But the scientific community corrected that. And if you look at the entire body of literature surrounding Reiki, surrounding vaccines, surrounding evolution, you see that the vast, vast, vast majority of science is in one particular direction and not the other, because that is the side that has been filtered from its biases. There should not be winners and losers in science. In science, everyone should win because everyone should have the goal of discerning truth. And if that is not your goal, if your goal is to bring your own truth to the bench, then you're not doing science. I'm sorry. So at that point, I was a new scientist. I defended my dissertation. I'd embarked on a fellowship here in Texas. And then Dover happened. This is in 2005. Is everybody familiar with the Dover trial? Yeah? Wave your flag if you've heard about Dover. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. It's made no impact whatsoever. So the Dover trial was seen as a massive referendum on intelligent design as science, right? So the question at Dover was the very question we're dealing with here tonight. Is intelligent design science? And many people looked at Dover as a sort of a culmination or as a modern interpretation of this trial, which is the Scopes monkey trial. Does everybody know about the Scopes monkey trial? Yes, I hope a few more. All right. And the Scopes monkey trial was also about the teaching of evolution, but it was a pro-creationist law that was being tested. In Tennessee, they'd passed a law saying that you cannot teach evolution to public school kids. Imagine that. Imagine somebody passing a law like that today. My gosh. I don't think that, not even in Texas would that happen. But in Tennessee in 1925, that happened. They passed a law that said, it was called the Butler Act, they passed a law that said it was illegal to teach evolution to children. And so, of course, the ACLU and other organizations got somebody to teach it, and then they had this massive trial. And technically, the person who taught it lost because it was illegal. It was a law. I mean, it might be a stupid law, but it was still a law. He lost, but the entire field of creationism, it wasn't even really a field at that time. It was just sort of like this idea that creationism should be what we're teaching, right? Of course, that's what we should be teaching. That was largely it was largely sort of forgotten about or sort of disregarded after that point. But how did we even get to that? Like, why are we even having trials like this in this country? Well, it's a longer story. So in the middle part of the 19th century, in Europe, there was a development in theology called higher criticism, or source criticism. The idea that you could look into the scriptures, you could look into how they were put together, you could look into how they were made, the Gospels in the Old Testament. And you could infer things from the sources. And you could sort of put them in a better context and understand them better than if you're just reading them straight through and taking them at face value. And this began to make a lot of sense to a lot of European theologians. It was very popular in Germany. It was very popular in the Netherlands as well. And toward the latter part of the 19th century, it began to emigrate across the Atlantic over into the United States. And it began to be very popular with some American theologians. They liked this idea. It made sense. A lot of the arguments were very good. And then all of a sudden, you look around in Princeton Theological Seminary, Harvard, Yale, all these bastions of Christian thinking were all embracing this new idea of higher criticism, which meant you couldn't read the Bible literally anymore. It was bad theology to do that. And that's when the rest of the American church said, whoa, hold up. Because they were also realizing that something else was coming over from Europe that they didn't like, that was challenging some of their preconceptions. And that was Darwinism, right? So On the Origin of the Species was published in the latter part of the 19th century, began to get accepted by the scientific community in England and in Europe, also in Germany. And it began to emigrate slowly across to the Americas. And you had pastors, you had leading pastors, intellectual pastors in this country giving sermons about Darwin, about how this needed to be incorporated into Christian life. And lots and lots and lots and lots of Christians were just not having it. Just absolutely not having it. And a group of them got together and they wrote these books together. These are called the Fundamentals of the Faith. And this is where the term fundamentalist came from. So the fundamentals of the faith were written in response to these ideas that Christians here in this country did not like and were reacting against. They were rejecting. They were scared of them, quite frankly. They did not like the implications. In fact, the implications of Darwinism were made clear. This is from an excerpt from one of the fundamentalist papers. One of these preachers says, "Far better would it be for all concerned if these evolution-affirming ministers had the courage of their convictions and sense of honor enough to compel them to leave the Christian church, taking with them those flocks who think like them and wish to follow. For they may be sure that the pretty little amenities of morality and sociology which they have substituted for the gospel of regeneration can never take its place. or lead a single soul out of the death and darkness of sin into the life and light that are to be found in Christ alone. The message was clear. If you accept Darwinism, you cannot be a Christian. That was what the fundamentalists believed. And their ideas began to spread and spread and spread. And these were first published in 1910. 1910 in this country, the fundamentalists became popular and widespread, and fundamentalism began to spread. And then in 1925, the Butler Act was passed in Tennessee, bringing us the Scopes monkey trial. And as I've already mentioned, although the trial was effectively a win, it discredited creationism for most of the country, at least outside of the South, let's say. Most of the rest of the country said, okay, well, that's kind of backwards, and we're just going to ignore them for now. We're just going to let them do whatever. Until this happened. You had two events happening very closely to each other. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, which was the first man-made satellite in orbit. They had gotten a head start on the space race. And America took a long, hard look at itself and said, you know what? We have not been advocating science like we should be. Clearly, the Soviets, they have a scientific program that is years beyond us. We can't even get close to this now. And so after Sputnik was launched, the entire fabric of the United States changed. And everything became pro-science, 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 pro-science. And then like that, all the creationism stuff was taken out, and all this evolution was put back in the public schools. And all the kids started learning evolution again. Well, guess who didn't like that? Henry Morris, one of the original creation scientists, wrote his book, The Genesis Flood, published in 1961. In a clear reaction to the pro-science environment that was happening in the United States after the launch of Sputnik, as we were being caught up by the space race, as everyone was becoming pro-science, Henry Morris said, whoa! Let's leave some room for creationism, please. Let's leave some room for God. He was very explicit about that. Except Henry Morris, in this pro-science environment, he couldn't just say, well, we're going to teach the Rock of Ages. We're going to teach Genesis 1:1 as is, like in Scopes. So he had to come up with an entirely different way of describing what he was doing, and that was called creation science, right? Everybody's pro-science, everybody loves science, so we'll just call it creation science. We'll just change the name. And people will look at it differently. They'll understand it differently, but it's the exact same thing being done for the exact same reasons. But then, in 1982, there was a challenge to that. Creation science was being taught in public schools, primarily in the South. And in Arkansas, there was a case that was brought to the Supreme Court, McLean versus Arkansas. And the court found that teaching creation science in public schools was unconstitutional. It was not right because it was not science, it was religion. And a similar case came to the court in 1987, Edwards versus Aguillard in Louisiana, which found basically the same thing. Creation science is out, it is not constitutional, it is not science, it is religion, was the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Now, while that was happening, while those decisions were being made, this book was being written. This book was actually being written or published, developed, directed here in Dallas-Fort Worth. I don't know if any of you know how important Dallas-Fort Worth is to the intelligent design movement, but we are ground effing central. So there's an organization based in Richardson, the Foundation for Thought and Ethics, and they began a mission to develop a brand new textbook. It was going to be the best of the best of creation science. And it was going to be developed and given to school kids, probably not public school kids, at least not primarily, but at least school kids. And the first version of this was published in 1989, written by Percival Davis and Dean Kenyon. But while the first draft of this was being developed, the Edwards versus Aguillard decision came out, which said creation science is religion. And so the authors of this book knew that they could not use that term, and they'd use it all throughout the book. They talked about creation science, creation science, creation science, creation scientists, all throughout the book. So they had a problem. But here's an easy fix. You just do a find and replace, right? Just find and replace the words. Creation science, we'll call it something else. What would we call it? I don't know. Let's see. Creation scientist is no good. So how about design proponents? This is when they got the idea to talk about intelligent design. This is literally when intelligent design was born as a viable idea. Now, as a matter of interest, Stephen Meyer was actually involved in this at this point. He got involved as it was transitioning from the first draft to the second draft. Stephen Meyer, as most of you know, is the director of the Discovery Institute, CSC, or SCC, whatever, the Intelligence Center for Science and Culture, CSC. So basically, the head of intelligent design was at the root of this book. I'm not saying that Meyer made this decision. I don't know. You might know. But somebody made this decision to change it to design proponents. Now, now they made this decision before it was published, but we know that they made this decision because at some point in the book, they made a typo. So instead of saying creation scientists, somebody had written or typed out creation scientists, which is just it's a silly typo, whatever. I mean, it doesn't mean anything really, except that when they came over to do a find and replace, the find and replace did not work properly there, and it turned this word into see design proponentists. Which is, again, this is kind of a silly whatever, not a big deal, except that it does demonstrate that the authors of this book were promoting creation science when they began writing it. This is, if you pardon the expression, a transitional fossil of the evolution from creation science to intelligent design. And this book, as I've mentioned already, involved Stephen Meyer, as you see here. He was involved in the early planning stages of the draft that was eventually published. By the time the second edition came out, he had recruited Michael Behe, Bill Dembski, and Jonathan Wells also to contribute to this book. This book of Pandas and People has the fingerprints of the Discovery Institute all over it. It could not be more of a Discovery Institute book if it was published by the Discovery Institute, which it is right now. Actually, the newest edition is now called The Design of Life. It's no longer called Pandas and People, and it is published by the Discovery Institute. Right? And this is an interesting evolution as well. So I mentioned already that it started off as the Foundation for Thought and Ethics, based here in Richardson, which published the first edition. They published the second edition with strong support from the people who would eventually become the Discovery Institute. And now the organization itself is Discovery Institute Press. And their offices here in Richardson are now a satellite office for the Discovery Institute. So it is literally a Discovery Institute book that has its roots directly in creation science. Which is why Judge John Jones, who heard the case, he was the district judge assigned to this trial in Dover, Pennsylvania. So, Of Pandas and People was being used to teach 9th grade biology in Dover. A parent complained. It ended up going to the court system. Judge Jones got the case. This was presented as being this massive review of intelligent design. Is intelligent design viable legally? Can it be defended as science in our courts so that it can be allowed to go into the public schools? John Jones, by the way, a Republican, a conservative, a Lutheran, said no. He said no, intelligent design clearly is not science. We can trace its origin from the creationist movement all the way to the fundamentalist movement of the early part of the 20th century. It is just the latest iteration of this development. It is the latest evolved version of that. There are perhaps other less charitable ways to describe it, but I'm doing my best here. Now, this is what Judge Jones anticipated, right? So he anticipated that this was probably going to be unpopular in certain circles. And he said, those who disagree with our holding will likely mark it as a product of an activist judge. If so, They will have erred, as this is manifestly not an activist court, and it is not. There are no similar decisions that he has made. Rather, this case came to us as the result of the activism of an ill-informed faction on a school board, aided by a national public interest law firm eager to find a constitutional test case on intelligent design, who, in combination, drove the board to adopt an imprudent and ultimately unconstitutional policy. The breathtaking inanity, let me say that again, the breathtaking inanity of the board's decision is evident when considered against the factual backdrop which has now been fully revealed through this trial. The students, parents, and teachers of the Dover Area School District deserve better than to be dragged into this legal maelstrom with its resulting utter waste of monetary and personal resources. Now again, this is not Richard Dawkins saying this. This is a conservative, Republican, Lutheran, Christian judge who spent weeks looking at all the facts and made up his own mind. And this reminds me a bit of the words of St. Augustine, right? St. Augustine wrote on Genesis, the book of Genesis, and the dangers of literal interpretations of Genesis. And St. Augustine said, "Now it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics, and we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn." Definitely what happened in Dover. If they find a Christian mistaken in a field which they themselves know well and hear him maintaining his foolish opinion about our books, how are they going to believe those books in matters concerning the resurrection of the dead, the hope of eternal life, and the kingdom of heaven? So this is the same anxiety that drove the fundamentalists to write the fundamentals of the faith. They were so worried that if people started to learn about Darwinism, that they would abandon Christianity. They would abandon belief in the immortal soul. They would abandon belief in the resurrection and salvation. And Augustine says, well, guess what? If you do a terrible job of defending Genesis, the same thing is going to happen. The exact same thing is going to happen, which is where the Discovery Institute is today. So I was at this Discovery Institute conference just a few weeks ago, and this was the keynote speech by Dr. John West, Darwin's corrosive idea. What is he worried about now? He's not worried about public schools. He's not worried about culture in general. He's worried about people losing their faith and leaving the church because of Darwinism, supposedly. Well, I got news for him. There's lots of people in the church that have no problem with Darwinism. Starting with Papa Numero Uno. Our Catholic friends, of course, have been watching all of this drama and enjoying it, right? This is probably hilarious to them. Since 1950, in fact, and in fact, they never said anything explicitly against Darwinism, but since 1950, long before the rise of the intelligent design community, the Catholic Church decreed that there is no conflict between evolutionary biology and Christian faith, as long as it's accepted that the soul is material. And Pope Francis himself says God is not a demiurge or a magician playing tricks with genes and chromosomes, adding information here, taking it away there, but he is the creator who gives being to all entities. He's much bigger than that. And there's a whole lineup of other Christians who agree with him. Number one being Ken Miller. And he is a good friend of the Discovery Institute by this point, I'm sure. Ken Miller gave a landmark talk at Case Western Reserve University called Why Intelligent Design Theory Isn't Science, right? Ken Miller is a cell biologist at Brown University, one of the Ivy League schools. He literally writes the book on biology. He and a partner together write one of the most popular common books for biology students, covering everything. He is a Catholic, he's relatively conservative, and he accepts evolutionary theory. And he says, if the practitioners of intelligent design actually seek to displace evolution scientifically, they need only produce the data to support their case, to carry the fight to the scientific community in a way that would win the battle of evidence in the free marketplace of scientific ideas. Instead, they have consistently rejected that route in favor of public relations activity and the generation of political support. Scientifically, it should be obvious that no idea deserves a place in the classroom, that it cannot win for itself on the basis of the evidence. That's what the Discovery Institute has done. They have gone into publishing textbooks, right? They're starting with Pandas and People, and now all these other ones that they have. We also have, in the United Kingdom, Dennis Alexander, a wonderful guy. I met him at a debate several years ago. He is an evangelical Christian, also a proponent of evolutionary biology, does not see any problem with evolutionary biology as a Christian. In fact, he says that intelligent design, the way intelligent design is being promoted now, is actually a harm to Christianity. It's bad theology. And he says it's a simple matter of fact that intelligent design forms no part of contemporary science. And finally, the big dog himself, Francis Collins, head of the National Institutes of Health. This is the guy that I really respect. Now, he is an evangelical Christian, absolutely. He used to be an atheist, was converted, now is an evangelical Christian. He was the head of the Human Genome Project, now is the head of the National Institutes of Health, the top scientist in this country. The top. You don't get higher than that. And he directs all of the research that the NIH supports, which is a crap load. And Francis Collins wrote a book, in part about his conversion, but also about intelligent design, creationism, which he says very explicitly, intelligent design fails in a fundamental way to qualify as a scientific theory. All scientific theories represent a framework for making sense of a body of experimental observations, but the primary utility of the theory is not just to look back, but to look forward. A viable scientific theory predicts other findings and suggests approaches for further experimental verification. Intelligent design fails profoundly short in this regard. It is a scientific dead end. No less than the John Templeton Foundation, which some of you may know as being really a kind of an interesting organization that funds research that tries to bring faith and science together, tries to find areas of intersect. The John Templeton Foundation, on their website, when asked this question, says, no, we do not support the political movement known as intelligent design. They don't call it a science, they call it a political movement. This is for three reasons. Number one, we do not believe the science underpinning the movement is sound. We do not support research that deny large areas of well-documented scientific research, which intelligent design has to do. And the foundation is a non-political entity. Now, those are the big dogs. What about everybody else? What about the people who've got their butts in the seats right now? Well, for most of this country's history, most of you accepted creationism in whatever form. But that's changing. And this is data from Gallup, who do these polls periodically. And they show, if you look at this as the entire American population, if you look at the trend of acceptance of evolution, it is on the way up, now over 50%. If you look at creation, it's on the way down, below 50%. And what's holding it up? Well, what's holding it up is the evangelical community. Right? So Protestants, non-evangelical Protestants, Catholics, they don't really accept creation. They're more for evolution. So the evangelicals, the modern-day fundamentalists, are the ones holding everyone else back, holding the rest of the Christian community back. Now, so let me answer the question. But I'm going to answer it two ways. I'm going to answer it, number one, in the most charitable way possible. What is intelligent design creation? I think it's probably best described as a kind of a philosophy. Probably best, I don't think it's good theology. I think it's okay philosophy. It's best kept in the philosophical setting. As Thomas Aquinas put it in his 5 ways, that whatever lacks knowledge cannot move toward an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed toward their end, and this being we call God. That's an interesting philosophical question to explore, but it is not scientific. There's no scientific program backing that up. And in 2004, Paul Nelson, another fellow of the Discovery Institute, admitted easily the biggest challenge facing the intelligent design community is to develop a full-fledged theory of biological design. We don't have a theory right now, and that's a real problem. Now, if I'm being my least charitable, how do I describe intelligent design? Well, I think very much like the Templeton Foundation, I would say it is a political and cultural movement that seeks to replace the carefully constructed and curated institutions of scientific learning with its own set of alternative facts, all in the service of a particular ideology that bears no resemblance to the Christianity that I grew up with, quite frankly. Ultimately, we are all of us interested in the origins of life. Of course we are. We are human beings. We are hopelessly self-absorbed creatures. But when I think about the Creator, I don't find it very compelling to think about him as some kind of tinkerer, as some kind of unceasing mechanic, as some kind of sleep-deprived graduate student slaving away in the corner of the laboratory, trying to induce a particular mutation in a gene to affect some new function. Such a Creator is not worthy of the name. In Genesis chapter 2, the scriptures tell us that heaven and earth were completed with all their array. On the seventh day, God had completed the work he had been doing. He rested on the seventh day after all the work he had been doing. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on that day he rested after all his work of creating. Such was the story of the creation of heaven and earth. If there is any God worth believing in, it is the God of the seventh day, the God who breathed over the waters of the chaos, spoke existence into being, and then rested. I thank you.
Zachary Moore.
A couple of things, and I can only obviously address a few things, Zach. But you led with simply saying that it's a dead question, it's already been answered. And unfortunately, for my benefit, you didn't really provide much indication as to why, simply saying the scientific community, even the legal community, has already declared that it's clearly not science. That doesn't really help me try to understand why, honestly, you would say that. When you talked about Dobzhansky's comment, yeah, I read that as an undergrad, I read it as a graduate student, and I did all my graduate work as a believer and a skeptic of evolution. And particularly my time at University of North Texas, I went as a skeptic of evolution. It was essentially an evolutionary biology program. My supervisor was Earl Zimmerman, who PhD from University of Illinois. I was more of a skeptic of evolution when I left than when I began. As I saw what the theory was basically based on, the evidences that were supposed to give me indication that this could account for all of life forms through this naturalistic process, I just didn't see that the evidence was there. And Dobzhansky's statement, as I continued into my career in molecular and cell biology at UTD, as I discovered more and more about how the cell functions, now we have a whole field called systems biology that simply is trying to describe how the cell functions as a clear system. There's information in the DNA, there's information in proteins, there are regulatory systems, all the things I outlined briefly in my talk. What I see is that nothing in cell biology makes sense apart from intelligent design. I don't see the evidence that these things, how the cell functions, how it operates, could have come about by some sort of natural process, whether it's through mutation, natural selection, or any other suggested natural process. Dobzhansky, sure, claimed to be a Christian. I don't know much about his actual background. But even when I read that the first time, I just didn't even understand why he said that. My own research at UTD, I didn't need any evolutionary concepts to do what I was doing when studying the electron transport chain and mitochondria of mouse cells, and evolution played no part. I had no reason to approach it. In my dissertation, closely supervised by my supervisor, we didn't mention any evolutionary concepts in trying to understand how that first complex was functioning. And I really see what I saw with a lot of cell biology papers in the journal Cell and others, they would often tack on at the very end a sequence analysis of this particular protein or this DNA sequence, and then try to construct some sort of phylogenetic tree of how this thing supposedly evolved over time. And what I began to see after a while was that they were just adding that on as an evolutionary inclusive statement. They needed something about evolution in the paper, they felt obligated to do so. But I didn't see that that added anything to the actual work that they had done. And I really agree with your description of science. We are trained to, as much as possible, leave our biases outside. Don't bring them to the bench. However, I find that that's a nearly impossible task to do. We are human beings. We all have a worldview. We do have biases, and everybody tends, especially if you're in evolutionary biology, you have a certain expectation of how your data is going to be interpreted, what it's basically going to tell you, not the details, but you're certainly expecting some confirmation of an evolutionary concept or evolution in general. And it's not terribly surprising that that's what they usually find. To try to say that all scientists are actually capable of leaving those biases outside is to make science somehow something less than a human endeavor. Because we all have them, and we all bring them to the table. We try to filter them out, as you mentioned, as best we can. But it's not, I'm not trying to say that it's not worth the effort, but in reality, it's a really tough thing to accomplish. You made the comment about science is about discerning truth, and I couldn't agree with you more. What I'm seeing is that the materialistic bias of so many within the biological sciences is the primary reason why most of them are saying intelligent design is not science. They are bringing their prejudices, they're bringing their bias to how we have gone about doing things. So much of what has been done early has been peer-reviewed. Dembski's The Design Inference, Cambridge University Press, clearly peer-reviewed. I mentioned the list of articles on Discovery Institute website. Over 100 plus articles now and growing of people involved in the intelligent design community, publishing papers both in Biocomplexity, which is a publication of the Biologic Institute, but also standard scientific journals all throughout. Doug Axe has published much of his work early in standard scientific journals. So, it's not that there's no history of peer-reviewed literature. And I think that materialistic bias from so many scientists is the primary stumbling block, not whether ID people are doing good science at all. You're bringing up the Dover case, I found really interesting. Judge Jones was an interesting character. I mean, one of the things he said, even when the trial was beginning, was that he was going to make sure he watched Inherit the Wind.
Good movie.
Oh, it's a lousy movie.
What? Spencer Tracy?
Because the play and film do not represent the Scope Monkey trial at all.
Wow.
It was a clear misrepresentation. And if he was going to use Inherit the Wind as to help give him background as to how to decide this case, he was definitely going in the wrong direction. That was clearly a play and film that was guided by a pure materialistic bias meant to prejudice the Christian community as much as possible. And so, yeah, the fact that he even mentioned that told me he was not approaching this objectively. He definitely saw this as an opportunity, in my opinion, to make a good name for himself. You mentioned in his opinion, he completely rejected the arguments from the ID community. Well, if you investigate his opinion, as Discovery Institute has in their book Traipsing into Evolution, the vast majority of his opinion comes straight from the ACLU brief. So how much of that was really his own thinking about intelligent design, and how much did he simply adopt what the ACLU told him? And he, for whatever reason, he chose to agree with them, but he didn't show any of his own reasoning in communicating his decision. He simply used the thinking process of the ACLU, and that I found very unfortunate. Your connection with pandas and people to intelligent design and all that, and really, it's kind of like you were weaving a vast creationist conspiracy there, if I may say so.
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay. I was part of the original Pandas and People. Charles Thaxton was one of the original authors to that. Dean Kenyon and Percival Davis came. I think it was with Percival Davis to start with, and then Dean Kenyon was brought in afterwards. And there was a bit of a falling out between Thaxton and FTE. But what the Dover School Board had actually approved was simply to have a statement read to biology classrooms that evolution is one way of looking at it. There is another view, intelligent design. There is a book in the library that will explain that to you. That was it. Would I have done it that way? No. I thought that was a bad idea. Because when you investigated, as the court did, their own deliberations, there was a clear religious intent to what they were trying to do. And the Discovery Institute actually ended up backing out of helping defend the law because they saw, this isn't defensible. We don't really want to be a part of that. Michael Behe also testified, but that was on his own. The Discovery Institute was not in support of that necessarily. Behe was there to defend himself. And his main protagonist, as you mentioned, Ken Miller. And there is a new film out called Revolutionary about Behe. And it goes into some real detail about how Ken Miller got so much wrong, and he knew it was wrong. About his interpretation of irreducible complexity, his ideas about the bacterial flagellum, how he misrepresented some of the actual data and research that's been done on that. And I find nothing in the Dover decision that tells me that intelligent design is dead. A lot of people proclaimed that at the time, but I didn't really find anything in that opinion that was discouraging to me. Certainly, it wasn't the best result, but when I began to look at Judge Jones' actual opinion, I thought, this is just a whitewash. He's just absorbing everything from the ACLU and rejecting everything else, and I didn't see much reasoning at all from his perspective. So, yeah. Okay.
Okay, Dr. Zach, 10.
Ray, I've seen you give sort of parts of the talk before. Mm-hmm. I've seen the Hawaii, the stones in the circle, and the Mount Rushmore. So those are interesting. I've done a lot of thinking about that, and so it seems like we have a really good capability of detecting design when we see it sort of spread out before us. I think you and I both would probably see the same things as having the same. If I could get everybody to raise the flags up real high.
I can't see any of you, by the way. These lights are
If
pretty
you could, well, maybe you could just follow that
over
over
there's
there.
One over there.
There's
okay,
a row over there.
Yeah, I see those.
So I've laid those out in a very specific design. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could infer from what you see what the design is.
I can make out the colors of, I can see Japan there, I see Great Britain, and I think...
Japan, Belgium, UK, Italy.
Yeah. No, I don't, with just those few, I don't think I can make out a pattern.
So you can't see design when it's right in front of you. I'm telling you it was designed.
Well, I'm seeing a portion of the whole picture, right?
But I'm even telling you that it was designed.
Oh, well, that's okay.
Do you have any inference as to what it might be?
Oh, I suppose there might be a collection of nations according to continents or something of that nature.
Okay, so it's a guess.
That's a
You
guess.
just guess.
Yeah.
How could you find out?
Well, I'd have to get these lights down and be able to see all of them.
Well, even if you
Get a
knew,
better idea.
even if you knew, would you know what the design was? Even
I'm
if
not
you
sure
could,
what you're asking me.
even if you could see all the flags that were being displayed in front of you, would you know what the design was that I had intended?
Perhaps, maybe not.
How would you know for sure?
Well, I would have to be able to discern an extremely clear pattern that would clearly bear them. It wouldn't be, it'd be hard to ascribe it to chance. It would be hard to ascribe it to some sort of natural law, but only as a result of some pre-planned.
Well, this is the total number is 72 flags, so it's the order of the flags is 1 to the 72nd power, so it's very rare.
Oh yeah. Okay. I don't know what you're asking now.
I'm just pointing out that it fills some of these
Sure,
criteria.
It's improbable.
Right. So, but
As
you,
I
so,
said,
you, so you're are you stymied then? You don't know how to figure it out?
Well, yeah, when you don't have all the data, it's kind of hard.
You don't have all the data. It's hard to figure out. One easy way to figure out is just to ask me. You'd say, Zach, what order did you put them in? Why did you put them in this order? Right. That would solve the problem easily.
Yeah.
And that's great. And that would answer the question.
Yeah.
We could all go home. The mystery of the flags has been solved. The problem is, as far as I know, we can't ask those questions of the designer. Can we?
Sure. No.
No. So how are we then making, how do we know that we're making correct design inferences when we look at things that, even if we know for sure that they're designed, how do we make our good inference as to what the actual design is?
That's what this book is about. That's what the signature cell is about.
So Dembski can tell me.
No, I'll tell you.
Okay.
When I gave you the example of John Loves Mary, written in the sand, we can easily exclude regularity. We can easily exclude chance. The only other option is design. You have a highly specific group of symbols, like your flags, that are arranged in a particular sequence that, as English speakers, we recognize that contains a message. It contains information. It's quite possible that you could have planned the arrangement of those flags, but it doesn't really communicate anything.
Okay.
You could have placed a design into it, but just by looking at the flags, it might not be all that discernible to me. It's clear to you, but not to me.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that when we look at the information content of DNA, there is a clear coded information in that. We talked about the genetic code. We talk about transcription, translation. Those are language terms, as I said, that accurately describe.
Have we queried the designer to determine that?
We don't need to.
So in order to determine what this design was, you had to query the designer.
Yeah,
But you've not queried the designer about DNA.
there's no need. Design's
It's the
clear.
exact same thing.
No, it's not.
It's a sequence of symbols in an order, in a very specific order. 72. It's about the same number of amino acids that's in cytochrome C. Let me ask you about that, actually. So in your dissertation, you reworked the cytochrome C, right? So you did transfections of human genomic DNA into Chinese hamster ovary cells.
Yeah.
Why did you put human DNA into hamster cells?
Well, it was actually mouse cells, LMTK minus cells, but
Oh, did the hamster cells not work out?
yeah, well, those came beforehand. That was what my supervisor originally did her work with.
Okay.
But we were transferring human DNA into them because we would be able to detect the human DNA through the repetitive allosequences that mouse cells don't have.
Why would you expect that human DNA would have any function at all in mouse cells?
Well, they're both mammals, and the as we already know, structural genes, basic proteins that have enzymatic function or structural functions, their amino acid sequence are very, very similar. And we've been able to show in some instances that some of those proteins can suitably replace original species.
Okay. Did you know that we're also able to do transcriptions of human genes into yeast cells with cytochrome C and replace the same function?
Yeah, cytochrome C, sure.
And they have completely separate sequences. The sequences could not be more different between human and yeast.
How do you mean could not be more different? How do we know it's cytochrome C?
The sequence of
Yeah.
the gene is almost completely different from the human sequence of cytochrome C, and yet the function remains the same.
Do you have any idea what the percentage
It's less than 40%.
similarity?
Yeah, it's less
Okay,
than
that's-
40%. Between chimpanzees and humans,
The
it's like
40%,
100%.
what that 40% is, however, makes a big difference.
Well, why is it 40% yeast, but I think it's about 83 or 84% with mice, and yet they both work the same way? Why is that the case?
Well, there could very well be over time that there can be what we call neutral mutations in various proteins, and the similarity in amino acid sequence might not no longer be the same, but
Sure.
the functional component primarily remains the same.
And the
That
longer
might
the
be
time
40%.
goes, the more neutral mutations it accrues.
Sometimes that's what you'd expect. Doesn't always work
And
out that way.
if that's the case, then we would expect that two sequences that have the fewest number of differences would be most closely related in history, right?
That's what the evolutionists would assume, yeah.
Well, no, that was the argument you were just making.
You're using one example, cytochrome C.
Well,
what we have found...
that's what you studied. That's what I studied
well,
up
no,
on.
I studied complex 1 of electron transport chain.
Okay.
So cytochrome C is
It's part of that.
yeah, well, yeah, it transfers things from one to the other. But when you start, it was a big project early on when we began realizing that similar proteins between different taxa had similar amino acid sequences. We started all sorts of comparisons for how we could maybe construct even phylogenetic trees from one protein here, one protein there, and sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. So they thought, well, let's start accumulating the sequences of all different kinds of proteins, and then we'll start trying to construct phylogenetic trees from that. And what they ended up finding out is that you simply can't do it.
It's more complicated.
It's
yeah.
far more complicated. You can use one protein, like a smaller cytochrome C, and you might be able to reconstruct some sort of reasonable phylogenetic tree out of that.
In fact, I can
But
do
it's
it.
not a universal principle.
I can do it with just at random. I happen to look at the gene that I studied, which is apolipoprotein E. I looked at that sequence analysis between humans, chimpanzees, mice, rats, all the way down to yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And found the exact same pattern that we see in cytochrome C. The further away you get in terms of basic organism homology, the further the sequence seems to be. And yet, when you do transfection studies, it works exactly the same. In fact, the paper that I published, the pictures that actually were published on the cover of the article, that was human apolipoprotein E functioning in a mouse model, an in vivo model.
Doesn't surprise me.
Well, it doesn't surprise me either because humans and mice are similarly related, right? So
Well,
it
they're
makes
certainly
sense within the
similarly
evolution.
constructed.
Well, so similar constructors, similarly related, right? So how do we determine between
Well, that's
the
a
two?
good question. That's a tough question.
So-
but right now, in biological science, you wouldn't be able to secure research money to determine if they're simply similar structurally rather than evolutionary related.
Well, I
The
think
materialistic bias wouldn't allow it.
I think we could lean on some Discovery Institute donors, maybe. So let me ask you this: how do we determine if you and I were related? What would we do?
We look at our family tree.
Look at our family tree.
yeah.
If we didn't have our family tree, or let's say I was adopted and I didn't have a family tree, how would we do it?
Well, we have some pretty similar structures. We are humans.
Okay, but I kind of want to know if we're like more closely related than I am to Ezra, who is my spiritual father, but not biologically. What do we do?
Well, you could do what a lot of people are paying a lot of money for, and that's do ancestry DNA and find out, as we do routinely now, just compare DNA.
So are you similarly skeptical about comparing DNA to determine how closely people are related to
Oh, no,
each other?
because I'm assuming all humans are related.
Okay, so why are humans special then in that respect?
Well, I would assume that all chimpanzees are related too.
So why are you drawing that line between humans and chimpanzees?
Because that's the one we can very definitely verify.
That humans and chimpanzees have not some shared ancestry?
No.
How do we know that?
How do we know that?
Yeah.
Have you investigated the fossil evidence?
Yeah.
Do you know the differences between Australopithecus and Homo erectus?
Yes.
Huge differences.
Oh yeah.
At least a half a dozen structural changes, and even some scientists have done studies on the population structure of humans, chimps. What kind of time period would be necessary for a single nucleotide substitution mutation to be fixed throughout the entire population?
I'm not
They
population
said it
genesis.
would take 6 million years
Okay.
to have all these
We
different
had time?
structural connections. Would require so many mutations, there simply isn't the time for that to happen naturalistically.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're good.
Dr. Bohlin, Dr. Moore? We're going to start with Q&A. That microphone right there that the very handsome, well-dressed Jason Hollis is checking.
Test. No.
Line it behind him, please. Hey, real quick, back there we do have T-shirts. We also have a way to donate if you'd like to donate. That's the thing I don't like to talk about. But we'd like to keep these events free. If you want to, please do. More importantly, Q&A. It's real simple. When you come to the mic.
I don't mind. It's the beerandbibleconsortium.com/donate.
Oh, beerandbibleconsortium.com/donate. We're easy to find on Google. Bible and beer, we're there. That's it. Is that me? Okay. When you come up here, number one, have a question. Number two, make it germane to tonight's topic. Number three, we are really pressed for time. You have 2 minutes to ask your question. And by that I mean at 2 minutes and 1, that mic will be muted, and then you're on video just moving your mouth. Okay? If you don't want to get up here, you can email your question to me, questions@thebibleandbeerconsortium.com. I will read your question in the accent of my choice. So, that said, Mr. Hollis, are we on?
Hello? Hello? No?
Hang on, keep talking. He's going to adjust it.
Test, test, test. All right, everyone here? All right, good to go. All right, Ray, thank you very much for coming down. One of the things that marks a scientific theory is that you have a mechanism by which something happens. So what is the mechanism that intelligent design proposes? It's not the code itself. The code is the result. What is the mechanism that intelligent design proposes?
Let me is this on? Is it on now? Yes? Okay. That's a really good question. And when you're thinking from a materialistic perspective, or what some people call methodological naturalism in the context of how science is done, it's reasonable to suspect that, or to ask, as you did, that there'd be a mechanism. However, when we're talking about ideas, or we're talking about information, where does that come from and how does it actually happen? If, as I tried to imagine, if I were going to ask a fiction writer, pick one, Dean Koontz or whoever, how do you come up with an idea for your next novel? I bet it's a pretty big hodgepodge of stuff. And they may have seen something here and that sparks an idea. Oh, where'd that idea come from? Well, trying to actually discern the mechanism of how even our human mind works is a really complex issue. And I can't say that I can even answer that question. How did the designer put the code in place? I don't know, but I don't think that disqualifies the pursuit of the ID as non-science.
Have there been any proposals for what a mechanism is?
I don't think there have been, precisely because, as most ID proponents, not all, are theists of one kind or another. There is going to be a hesitation to try to prescribe ahead of time, or in our own minds, how we think God did it. Even when you read Genesis 1, if you're, say, a young age creationist, whatever, Genesis 1 is pretty minimal. It doesn't really tell you a lot. And so trying to draw any kind of clear conception, for instance, people talk about the created kind. Well, that word kind is used in Genesis 1, and so we refer to it as a created bara min, they use that term now. But the word kind isn't really used elsewhere in the Bible, so we really don't know biblically what a kind is. They've come up with their own ways of trying to assess, well, they're able to interbreed, or let's say they could interbreed in the past, or all kinds of things come up, but even the scripture doesn't give you sufficient information to know what a kind is. But as I said, that doesn't particularly trouble me, because if I tried to ask a creative person, where did your idea for that painting come from? Well, they could describe a few experiences they had, but where the idea came from, the process, the mechanism, doesn't mean it's not an idea.
Of course, that problem only exists if the designer is God, right? So the designer does not necessarily have to be God. It's only within the creationist tradition that the designer is necessarily God.
Okay, hi. You were asking what science is, and in order to be science, there has to be a testable hypothesis. And from what I'm understanding, intelligent design says that something is irreducibly complex. when has that hypothesis ever increased our understanding of anything? Like you were pointing out the cell, how that's supposedly, like, when it's saying a bacterial flagellum is irreducibly complex, ever helping to understand actually how the bacterial flagellum actually came into place?
Well, not so much how it came into place, but how things operate. For instance, when I was a grad student at UTD in the mid-'80s, late '80s, this whole idea of junk DNA was coming into popularity. And it came about because we realized that when you look at human DNA, only about 2% of that DNA actually codes for proteins. And when you look at the rest of the 98%, it appears to be just a lot of repetitive sequences, some of them short, some of them long, some of it seemingly nonsense. We found sequences that seemed to look like genes. They called them pseudogenes. They didn't really make a protein, perhaps, but a lot of stuff that just looked like junk. And they incorporated that into an evolutionary perspective. DNA, since it is self-replicating in a way, and the genome just gets replicated there's going to be a lot of stuff that gets left over, gets inserted by viruses and all kinds of things. It just hangs around, and it's just junk. It's not useful. But even when I was a grad student, I never published it, never wrote it, or anything like that. I just never liked the idea of junk DNA, because in my mind, if the DNA is actually a designed entity, I'm not expecting there to be all that much junk. Over time, could mistakes and problems enter in? Sure, but not 98%. And Bill Dembski, in his book, The Design Inference, even made that prediction, which Meyer quotes in Signature in the Cell, that he said, well, according to evolution, I could see how you'd expect most of that DNA to be junk. But as a design theorist, that doesn't make sense to me. I would expect more of it to be far more useful. And following the Human Genome Project came a project called ENCODE, which I'm forgetting what all that actually stood for. But they started looking at what's all this DNA doing now that we have the full sequence. And now they've been realizing that a lot of those repetitive sequences, the short ones, the long ones, do have a biological function. They're involved in regulatory processes, and some are saying now as much as 80% of our DNA has some sort of function in the cell. So what I would maintain is that if we had followed a design perspective, we'd have been discovering that a lot quicker than when we had followed the evolutionary. We thought it was junk. Who's going to look in the junk? Who's going to investigate that? Not until we had the full sequence did we even think to start checking into it.
But how did the hypothesis that it was irreducibly complex get you to what actually the junk DNA did, rather than actually investigating it?
Well, irreducible complexity is a concept within intelligent design. It's not a concept that I address directly this evening, but irreducible complexity would be a way to help discover how things function. And for much of science, that's a lot of what we do. How does this work? How did this come about? How does this actually work within this context over this period of time? And if something like the bacterial flagellum is irreducibly complex, which means it has to have at least 2 or more parts, and all those parts are necessary for function, then we would begin to expect that more of, and we use this terminology all the time, even evolutionists, we talk about molecular machines. We talk about biological systems. Well, if we had approached a design perspective from the start, we'd have looked at it that way, and we've been expecting more machines, more things that have to have a precise biological or amino acid sequence in order for their function to be useful at all.
Can you point to one thing in biology that is irreducibly complex?
Yeah, I would say the bacterial flagellum was one of them. The ATP synthase in mitochondria, which is complex 5, the electron transport chain. We've seen papers coming out recently where they're saying that, and this just astounded me when I saw it, that the energy conversion from the proton pump from the inner membrane to inside the mitochondrial, which is what generates the energy, is nearly 100%. We have found nothing else in biological organisms that has 100% energy conversion. Nothing is lost. According to the second law of thermodynamics, that shouldn't happen. But if you have a design system that is irreducibly complex, I would at least see the possibility that could happen.
One last thing, Zachary. I'd like your answer on this. Is there anything in biology that's irreducibly complex, including the things that he's named?
Well, by the definition that Behe puts forward, there's sort of lots of things, right? So as biological systems evolve, they sort of evolve different functions. They specialize in different areas. They lose other functions, other things that have brought them to that area. There's what's called the scaffolding idea, the idea that you'll have certain systems and structures in place that will allow something to come into existence that aren't necessary after that is coming to existence. For example, like this building, right? So how in the world did this ceiling get up? How is this held up like this, right? So certainly a ceiling like this size, this heavy, would never be able to be held up on its own, right? Of course not. We know that there was a scaffolding put up, there were cranes that held it into place as everything was cemented in it, and those are now gone. Well, so similarly in biological systems, we know there's some evidence of these sort of scaffolding things happening that can allow systems to come into place that after the system is fully functional and quote-unquote irreducibly complex, the scaffolding is no longer needed and that can go away. So there's lots of examples of that, absolutely. It just does not mean that there's a design.
My question is sort of similar to the first one, but directed more at Dr. Moore.
Yes,
So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Professor John Lennox. He's a professor at Oxford and has written a lot on this. Basically, a lot of his books come to a point of saying that science doesn't fill, it's not gaps to be filled, that you can believe in these scientific theories, but it doesn't mean that you're disproving faith or agency. And I enjoyed your presentation, but I think that at the same time, it didn't necessarily address the agency question. So what do you have to say about?
So when you say agency, do you mean free will? Is that what you're talking about?
No, in terms of like creator. And
Is there a creator?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there's no reason, based on anything in science, to disbelieve in any creator. Let me just say that flat out. And I'm not here as an atheist. In fact, everything that I've said here tonight, I would have said as a Christian. I am now an atheist. But everything I've said here tonight, I would have said as a Christian. I was raised a Christian. And everyone I've quoted tonight, in fact, in my presentation, are Christians as well. So there is absolutely no reason why anything in science should tell you that there is no creator, that you should not have faith. Science cannot inform that. Now you can if you so choose. And there are some people who would love for you to do this. Cough, Richard Dawkins, cough. Who would love for you to look at the evidence of evolution and say, well, I'm just going to be done with God from now. Right? It's clearly that God is ridiculous, God is unnecessary, I'm just going to be done with God. You do not have to do that. I am not here tonight to convince you to do that. Right? What I'm here tonight to do is just to talk about intelligent design. Intelligent design as an idea put forward is if you want to maintain your faith, by all means. Intelligent design is not the best way to do that. That's all I'm saying. You believe in a creator with my blessing.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed both of y'all's talks. My question is also kind of directed towards Dr. Moore. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm putting words in your mouth. It seems as if your presentation was geared more towards semantics than actually answering the question posed for today's debate. You seem to say that intelligent design is actually creationism, and creationism is not science, therefore intelligent design is not science. I was wondering if you could kind of explain basically define science, or if you can possibly define how you see science, and then explain why intelligent design cannot fall in that category.
So here's where that comes down, where the rubber meets the road with that. So for science, as Dr. Bohlin and I both agree, you do not bring your biases to the bench. When you explore questions, you do not have an answer in mind. The problem with intelligent design is it has an answer in mind. When it looks at the world, it has to see that there is a designer who is not just that there's a creator, right? So again, let's make a distinction between whether or not there's a creator and whether there's some particular designer doing little, graduate student level functions on chromosomes and DNA and adding information here or there, right? Is that the case, or is there some sort of a creator who set all this in motion and allowed this to come to be, right? So there's two different questions. So intelligent design comes to the question with the answer already in mind. It knows that there has to be a designer who is responsible for all this, and that is not science. That is what makes it not science.
So why do you believe intelligent design comes with an answer already in mind, but evolution does not?
So they say that they do. So if you look at, this is a book edited by Dr. Bohlin, Creation, Evolution, and Modern Science, right? So this is the foreword was written by Philip Johnson, who's the father of the movement. So this is right here, I'm reading it. The intelligent design movement starts with the recognition that in the beginning was the Word, and in the beginning God created. That's starting with the answer already answered. Period.
If I may just add a
Yeah.
little bit. You did not seem to address, I guess, the same things that Dr. Bowen addressed, in the sense that he discussed scientific methods. He discussed how people, and I'm not a scientist by any means. He discussed how people get to certain conclusions in science.
Sure.
And you did not really discuss any of that. You, I guess, didn't really define science and how, again, intelligent design doesn't fall under that umbrella. You just seem to have quoted a lot of people. You quoted popular opinion. But I just really kind of want to know the answer of how you define science and why it's not.
I think I already answered that, right? So science, that is fundamental level. Science is a process that we have put together to exclude our bias as much as possible. And if you come to the table with your bias, and you will only accept what confirms your bias, you're not doing science. Intelligent design does that. That's why it's not science.
Sure. And so you're saying that evolutionists never come to the table with biases?
No.
Okay.
Not in the same way. No, not in the same way. No, so evolutionists do not have some religious need to come to the table to reinforce evolution, right? So all the people that I've quoted tonight are all Christians, right? These are not atheists. These are not Richard Dawkins coming to the table to say there is no God because of evolution. These are Christians. They do not have some particular materialist. So Dr. Bohlin has mentioned many times, well, the problem is they bring this materialist bias to the table. These are evangelical Christians. Francis Collins is an evangelical Christian coming to the table. You read his book. He is crazy for Jesus, believe me. And I disagree with him on a lot of things with regard to that, and that's fine. But you cannot make the claim that he comes to the table with this materialist bias and wants to see his bias reinforced. He is appraising the evidence as it exists. He's doing it right.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
You have a very idealized view of scientists. This was what I can say here. Yeah, as I admitted, the process of science and how science is done wants to be able to eliminate those biases as much as possible. But it's, especially when you're coming to the origins questions, that's nearly impossible to do. And I'll admit it for myself. Do I have an expectation that I will find some evidence for an intelligent designer? Yeah, but I'm not necessarily certain where I'll find that. And so, as you said, there are plenty of other evolutionists, Richard Dawkins, Jerry Coyne, so the list goes on and on and on, who use evolution as a means to promote atheism.
Yep.
And even in the context of science, many of them actually do see science as a way of doing things that specifically provides materialist answers.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And I offer, you may be familiar with this quote from Richard Lewontin, famous Harvard population geneticist, evolutionary biologist. He wrote a review of Carl Sagan's final book called The Demon Haunted World in the New York Times Review of Books. And his basically closing statement was simply to say, we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
Right.
And he's not speaking just for himself.
Well, no, but you understand what he's speaking about is methodological materialism.
Oh, no.
Yes, yes.
He never makes that distinction.
No, it's very clear.
It's
very clear by the context what he's
not
talking
at
about.
all.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Zach, how do you draw that conclusion?
So he's talking
That's
about
incredible.
an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts. That's method. That's the method of science. That's exactly what. What he's talking about there is he's saying, look, we cannot answer questions in the laboratory by saying some fairy did whatever, right? So when I was in graduate school, I did all these experiments, whatever, and I had to understand what was happening. I had to defend what it was that I was doing by purely material terms, right? I could not say, well, and then, and I would have loved to do this, by the way, because I had a lot of experiments that went haywire and went exactly the wrong way that I was anticipating. I would have loved to have said, and then an angel swooped down and stuck a finger in the buffer and swirled it around, and then everything went crazy. That would have been very helpful to me, but it would not have made scientific sense. So in terms of the methods of science, we cannot allow for the methods of science to be anything other than naturalistic. Otherwise, it goes crazy.
But when he said in the previous part of the quote, it is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation, not material investigation, but a material explanation of the phenomenal world. He just says right there, it's not the methods.
What's the next? What's the remainder? Right, it's to the contrary.
A priori
We
adherence
have
to material
right,
causes, not
to create
material
an
method.
To create an apparatus of investigation. That's the method.
But it's
he's
relying on an a priori commitment to material causes.
In order
That's all that exists.
order to create an apparatus of investigation. That's the method.
It's the commitment to the a priori adherence to material causes that derive the method.
You do. You have to adhere to a priori materialism in order to do methodological naturalism. In order to do science, you can't do it any other way.
Sure, I did it.
Right.
I'm not a materialist.
Right, and neither is Francis Collins.
So
So this has nothing to do. Materialism has nothing to do with
it has
evolution.
everything to do with it.
All right, we have lots of evolutionary biologists who are not materialists.
Not many, but we have some.
We have more.
Francis Collins is not an evolutionary biologist.
He's recruiting a lot. Ken Miller is a cell biologist who...
Cell biologist, not an evolutionary biologist.
Okay.
There's a difference.
Okay. So are you saying that only evolutionary biologists are atheists?
No.
There are no evolutionary biologists?
I didn't say that.
Well, then what's the problem?
Because you said they're evolutionary biologists. I'm simply saying no,
they
are
are, okay, they're scientists who affirm evolution. How's that?
They're for evolution, sure.
Okay. We've got it settled.
Sort of.
All right, next on the dock.
Get it?
First off, I really enjoyed both speeches today. But during the talking points, the analogy was brought up that of your neighbor winning the lottery for 3 weeks in a row. And while that makes sense on Earth where you have 7 billion people and the odds of that happening would be extremely astronomically small, I don't see how that analogy is applicable to this situation when in the context of the universe, there's so much more where this could be happening that the odds would be much larger in the context of the universe rather than the lottery on Earth. And I don't see how that analogy was applicable to this discussion.
Well, it's a good question, but it does relate simply to the probabilistic resources you have available and the probability of that event actually occurring. So all I was doing was in the context of that, with the probabilistic resources you have of 7 billion plus people, when you look at that particular event with those resources, it ain't going to happen. Yeah, you can still calculate a probability, but that doesn't mean anyone's going to expect that probability to actually occur because of the lack of probabilistic resources. When you look at even the universe, I don't know what question you're wanting to address here, whether it's the origin of life, or is that kind of what in making the universe, is that what you're kind of referring to, or?
Yes.
Okay. Well, with the origin of life, you need a lot of a lot of things to come right into play. A lot of things have to line up, and it's not just as simple as just add water. You need a planet that is within a circumstellar habitable zone. You need a planet that's about the right size, or at least can't be too large, can't be too small. It has the right type of rotation. As we've learned for life on Earth, we need a moon that is large enough to influence the tides and to influence to stabilize the tilt of its axis. You need an oxygen-rich atmosphere. You need plenty of water, obviously. You need continents as well as oceans to develop the diversity of life that we have here in order to develop complex life. And that's just giving a half dozen. There are, Hugh Ross from Reasons to Believe has put together now probably over 800 parameters that have to be within fairly reasonable guidelines in order for a planet to be habitable for complex and certainly intelligent life, okay?
But
and when you start putting those probabilities together and making the same calculation, you find out that the universe itself isn't big enough for this to have happened just by chance.
But obviously the things did line up in the way to produce life, and I don't think it's fair to look back in retrospect and say the odds of this happening were so small, therefore there must have been some intervention or some design for it to happen, because it
Why
did.
not? Because what I'm saying is that strictly by probability, this isn't going to happen by natural process. And if it's not going to be by natural law, if it's not going to be by chance, then you need something else, and the only other something else is by design. To arrange everything for complex life to exist here.
Hello. So my question is whether or not there have been advancements in our understanding of intelligent design and or evolution over time, and how have those advancements helped us in benefiting society?
Are you addressing that?
I guess to either. I mean,
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, a lot of what intelligent design is focused on at the moment is trying to assess both the negative and positive side of the origins question. Is natural process sufficient to account for what we see? And if it's not, does the evidence that we see correspond with an intelligent design perspective? How that actually gets specifically applied in a research context is a little bit more difficult. I do know that Jonathan Wells, a fellow with Discovery and the Biologic Institute, put forward a theory which I'm not really full on all the details several years ago about the centrioles and involving cell division and the separation of chromosomes, and he applied initially a design perspective to certain kinds of motors that would rotate and pull things apart, and what needed to take place. He applied a design perspective to propose his ideas and experimented on them. And I don't really know all the details as a result of that. It's fairly vague in my head, I'll admit. But I do remember him saying that he did get it accepted to a research journal out of Britain, out of England, and when he finally got notice that he was called and he was told that we've accepted your paper, it's passed the reviewers, you've made the corrections, and we're fine to publish it. I just have one question. Are you the Jonathan Wells that's connected with the Discovery Institute? He said, yes. We deny your publication. So and what I'm trying to say, we've made attempts, and sometimes we're simply frustrated by that attempt. And once people discern that there's a clear design perspective involved or design proponent involved, good luck trying to get that published. So we're working at it. The Biologic Institute, which is partly funded by Discovery Institute, is now employing several PhD scientists who are working on the design-oriented projects all the time and getting them published.
Send his paper to me. I'll submit it under my name. We'll see what happens. No, I'm not joking.
Okay. I don't know if, yeah, I'll check into it.
Thank you.
Did you want to speak to how evolution has progressed?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Was the question intelligent design and evolution, or just intelligent design?
Yes.
It was both.
It was both.
So, yeah, I was just wondering like, if there's any way to get a practical application out of intelligent design or advancement in that field, and then conversely, on does evolution, do we have advancements that benefit society, directly attributable to our knowledge of evolution?
Oh, yeah. So for evolution is easy. For intelligent design, I would say this, actually. Two things. I do have to say that the fight against junk DNA, the characterization of junk DNA by intelligent designers, was right. And it was good that they pushed against that and encouraged people to examine basically the non-coding regions of the genome. Because it turns out there is lots of regulatory sequences in there, which are fascinating. Now, that being said, scientists were already doing the same thing. So we didn't exactly need the intelligent designers to do it, but it was great that they did it, and it was consistent with what turned out to be good science. The other thing I would say about intelligent design is, especially with regard to what happened with Dover, it really kicked scientists in the butt and encouraged them to do a lot better PR stuff than what they had been doing before, because the intelligent design movement does fantastic PR, really fantastic. So with regards to evolution, two really fantastic examples that I can think of just off the top of my head. So I do a lot of assistance with cancer research, and one of the key paradigms that has developed over the past decade or so is the idea that tumors actually evolve over time, and that the tumor that you're diagnosed with is not necessarily the tumor that stays with you as you go through your disease, because the tumor is constantly evolving, right? The tumor is this little nexus point of fast replication and intense selection, because your body does not want the tumor to live. Right? So the tumor has to evolve in order to escape past the immune system and other checkpoints that keep it in place. And so our understanding of the evolution of tumors helps us to treat them and eventually kill them. The other place that it is very helpful is with antibiotics. So bacteria are also highly, they have a very fast replication cycle, and they're very sensitive to environmental pressures, which we give antibiotics to people in order to beat those back. The way in which we give people antibiotics has changed completely. The paradigm has shifted completely because of our understanding of the evolution of these bacteria as they go through different populations, as they go through the hospitals, basically. And hospitals have now constructed entire evolution-derived paradigms of how to give certain antibiotics in the right order so that you hit the bacteria before it evolves in order to become resistant to the antibiotics. So evolution has changed the way we treat cancer, and evolution has changed the way we treat infectious disease.
Thank you.
Thank you both tonight, first off, for your time and your expertise in talking about this subject. So for my question, I'd like to keep it in the context of theists. So keep the atheist out of this question in your answer. But you can still answer this if you'd like. But so for those that do believe there is a God, a creator, a first cause, if you will, at what point does intelligent design stop being intelligent design and just become Darwinism or evolution or theistic evolution, whatever you want to call it? So I'm thinking along the lines of, okay, say you have a student who starts as sort of your fundamentalist Christian, 6,000-year-old Earth, literal six-day creation with a seventh day of rest, all of those things. Then they say, okay, well, actually, I believe the Earth is, several billion years old. Okay, I do believe that life has sort of come about over a long period of time, that there was a time, significant amount of time before humans came, and then humans came on. Okay, I start to believe that instead of just maybe random bursts, it may be a gradual process as the Earth went through certain shifts and environment began to help life develop through minute variation over time. I mean, at what point of adopting these sort of increasingly evolutionary beliefs does it stop becoming intelligent design, in your opinion, Dr. Bohlin, and Zach, too, if you want to add to it afterwards?
Well, that's an interesting question. Well, Zach has mentioned Francis Collins several times, and clearly a very strong evangelical Christian. He's gone on medical mission trips and is very effusive in the sense of his defense of the existence of God and of the Christian God. But he clearly also accepts biological evolution. And he's been very resistant to the intelligent design community. And obviously that doesn't mean he's not a Christian. Don't ever interpret anything I say as, okay, Francis Collins can't be a Christian. Well, no, that's not the case at all. It was interesting in his book, I think it was called The Language of God, that as he walked through some of the scientific evidence, when he was talking about the universe and our solar system, he basically made several intelligent design statements that isn't it unusual that these things happen to be this way, and he almost read God into that context to say God seemed to have orchestrated things in the universe, in our solar system. And I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but this was just the impression I got from what he was writing and saying, that you could, I made, my comment was, and I wrote it in the margin, he's making a design inference concerning the origin of the solar system and the universe. But somehow when he flipped to biology and cell structure, he left all that behind. So for whatever reason, for Francis Collins, he's willing to entertain a design inference in the context of astronomy and solar dynamics, the solar system, but not in biology. And I found that even when I was reading the book, I mean, that's a strange disconnect. I don't understand why he takes that perspective.
If I can, and Zach, I know maybe you can help me on this too. I've read The Language of God, and I've followed some of his work, and my understanding is that he believes God is the one who kind of put the systems in place, the sort of designer of the natural laws that drive evolution. Does that sound right, Zach? I mean, that's my impression at least. So would you consider Francis Collins, by your definition of intelligent design, sort of an ID theorist, if he believes that God set up the system which enables life to come about through a sort of Darwinian process, without God sort of dealing with the minutia, without driving those processes sort of step by step himself? Would you consider that ID still because God ultimately set that system in place, or does God need to be kind of driving it every step along the way for it to be intelligent design theory?
He was asking you, I think.
Oh, okay. My turn. So here's sort of where I break it down, right? And I fully sympathize with the theistic evolutionists. When I was a Christian, that's exactly where I was. I didn't even consider the possibility, I already went over that in my presentation. Here's where I sort of draw the line. Because a lot of the intelligent design arguments focus on bits of genetic information or tiny little systems, proteins interacting. For me, and you know, maybe this is my own bias or my own background, for me coming up as a graduate student, the types of things that are described as being like the evidences of God, you know, making some tweak in a gene or making some tweak in a protein pathway, those are all the sorts of projects that you would give to a graduate student to waste his time on for like 2 years in the back of the laboratory, right? He'd just be sitting there pipetting away, trying to subclone something, trying to make something work, you know, running the gels, it doesn't work, okay, got to try it again. When I think of God doing that, and those are the types of things that are put forth as evidences. When I think of God doing that, I think, what a small God. What an ineffectual God. The God that has to come down and work like a graduate student in the back of the laboratory doing some stupid subcloning project in order to make, I don't know, horseshoe crabs, you know, their blood work or whatever. You know, that is not a creator, capital C creator to me. The capital C creator to me is the God who said, let there be light, and there was light, right? There's nothing more else that he needs to do, right? Just say the words and it happens. So, you know, I'm a big fan of Tolkien, right? So if you go to the Silmarillion, you read the Ainulindale, and you read how the world of Tolkien was created, you know that Eru Ilúvatar just gave this music to the Ainur. and they sang it into existence. They didn't have to, they turned after the song was over and they saw, and there was the world, basically. They didn't realize it, but the music itself had created the world. They didn't have to go down and bang things together, smack rocks together, or knit, elves' bodies together. They just sang and it happened. To me, that's the creator. If there is ever a creator that I worship again, that's the creator I want to worship.
Just to follow up on that, so when it comes to evolution, let's go back to Christian Zach for a second.
Sure.
Does that mean that the song is put in place in the sense that he can create just these sort of initial parameters for evolution to take place on the earth, and that's capital C creator to you?
That's capital C creator.
Okay, just
on
wanted
the
to make
seventh
sure.
day he rests.
Okay,
That's
just
it.
wanted to make sure
He's
I
done.
had that. All right, thank you.
First question to you.
Yes.
So whenever you went in your presentation of the creationism question is dead, did you mean by like totally left, right, up, down dead, or the methods that they use are dead? Or was there anything still viable, or was it just no, creationism and everything that it kind of is advocating is, we've already answered it, law, science, all
Right.
that?
Well, so first of all, it's very sort of ironic for me to be saying that when I'm standing up here on stage with the question at hand being, is intelligent design science, right?
True.
So here we are, and I'm standing up here talking about this question, which I say is dead. The reason why I say that is because outside of this room, there is nobody asking this question. So just to give an example,
Okay.
I have a Google News feed. Does anybody use Google News? It's really fantastic. You can set any sort of search terms. You can find any sort of thing you want. I've got a Google News feed for intelligent design. Just because I'm curious. I've had it in place for years and years and years, and it sends me whatever news stories pop up for intelligent design, which is fascinating and helpful. For the past 5 years at least, the only websites that it has ever served to me have been from the Discovery Institute's website. That's it. Nobody else is talking about intelligent design. It is not a seriously considered thing in the academy. It is not a seriously considered thing legally. Right? Dover pretty much ended the career of intelligent design in the public schools. The only way that intelligent design has any sort of legs is within the evangelical church, within the new fundamentalist community that still exists.
Okay. Follow
Don't
on.
worry, we're not going away.
Right, no. They're not going away tomorrow, but they are.
Oh, we're not going away.
I mean, if you look at the trends, right? So if you look at, Barna, right? Barna has done these studies. Barna has done these studies. If you look at the demographics, acceptance of these sorts of ideas drop away precipitously as we go down the demographic ranges. So that means that teenagers right now in high school, they are not interested in questions of intelligent design. It's not even on their radar. It is primarily on the radar of, well, quite frankly, people Dr. Bohlin's age.
I can get that. Okay.
Yeah.
That'll be something for later. So then the follow-on question. So I'm an engineer, just to give you the background. So calculus, for the longest time, didn't make sense to me. That didn't necessarily stop architects, engineers, any other people from using it. Is there any reason from a very broad, maybe like a 2-point, that the idea of macroevolution, or the idea that from goo to you, is actually more viable than something like irreducible complexity, specified complexity, or anything else that creationism advocates?
In 2 points?
Well, if you can. If it's going to be too broad, then I'll go on to the
So
third one.
there's 5 points. I have a lecture on this. Number 1, the functional redundancy of the amino acid sequences of highly conserved genes. Number 2, the functional redundancy of the nucleotide sequences of said genes. Number 3, the existence of conserved pseudogenes. Number 4, the existence of highly conserved transposons. And number 5, the existence of highly conserved endogenous retroviruses. Those are only from the molecular evidence. But with those 5 pieces of evidence, that's enough to demonstrate macroevolution.
Fair, and I'll have to look into that. So then the last question, I really respected what you said to, and this will be addressed to both of you, really respected what you said to the lady back there of, I'm not here to present my argument to say that you cannot or shall not believe in a creator. I'm not trying to tell you what or should you not believe. I'm here just to present the evidence, the point. What you do is up to you. I can respect that. I can get behind that, especially with the don't bring your bias to the table. If that's the case, And we have brought up that the idea of creationism is backed as kind of a religious kind of a thing. Would either of you would then say, is faith itself a bias?
Is faith a bias? You want to take that?
It depends on what your faith is in.
Ooh, touche.
As human beings, we all have faith in something. Would you allow me to answer the question, please, without interruption? Thank you for that courtesy. The scientist walks into the laboratory with faith that the laws of nature are the same today as they were yesterday. Now, we've had a lot of practice and experience to be willing to say that's a very reasonable faith to have. But at the same time, there is still an element of the unknown. There's an element of faith in that process. For me, as a believer, I believe I have a confidence that the laws of nature will be the same today as they were yesterday, because I believe there's a God, an intelligent designer, who has initiated all of those laws and has given me no reason to suspect he's just going to pull them all out from under us. So, we all exercise faith in one degree or another. And as I said, what matters is what's the object of your faith.
Right. And I think what Dr. Bohlin is talking about, faith sort of as trust, which is sort of what he's getting at. Faith as trust. I think, I trust the methods of naturalism, the methodological naturalism approach of science, because it works, right? So far, I've not been disappointed by science. I may have been disappointed by scientists. Maybe Dr. Bohlin thinks I have too optimistic a view of scientists. But the science as a process, it just flat out works. I mean, it's the computers, everything, the lights, everything about how human society is now, how wonderful things have become, even under the Trump presidency. Yes, we still live in a very wonderful, blessed country. And that is because of science, and that's fantastic, right? And if there's a creator, I don't want to rain on that parade. If there's a creator, the worst thing, or I should put it the other way, the best thing that would come about if I were persuaded that there were a creator.
Okay.
And I'm not opposed to it, right? And in fact, I've publicly said many times that the teleological argument is the strongest argument for me, hands down. When I walk outside and look at the night sky, when I walk through the woods, the teleological argument grasps at my heartstrings like crazy. But there are some other things that mitigate against that. But that being said, if there were a creator, it would be nice to know that there was a signature on the painting, right? So we had something to attribute this all to, for good or for ill, right? I'm not saying that there aren't other judgments that might follow, but it would be really cool to have a signature on the painting to say, hey, I know who painted that. So I'm not opposed to that whatsoever.
I understand. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. We're going to make the last questions really, really quick.
All right,
Super
I'll
quick.
try and be quick. Two basic rules of science.
Yes or no question.
If your theory cannot be measured, then it is useless. If your theory doesn't fit the data, then it is wrong. So, that being said, how can intelligent design even be measured?
I don't know.
The information content.
We got to leave aside statistical answers because those are basically manipulation of data, and that's garbage in, garbage out.
That's the data.
That's not data.
Sure it is.
That's not a measurement.
There is no data in the genetic code. There's no data?
So it's made up. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. I'm sorry, I don't understand that question and that response.
All right, I'm going to try to be quick. So, Zach, I wanted to kind of challenge your whole explanation of bias. From my understanding, the scientific method and my whole, I guess, profession is with an astronomical point of view when it comes to creationism or intelligent design.
The astronomical point of view, what does that mean?
Just in terms of physics instead of biology. So my whole knowledge is based on something else. So from my understanding of the scientific method, you have to make an observation and come up with a possible conclusion that you can test or inference is a better word, that you can test in order to, reach a separate conclusion, and then in order to test that conclusion, you have to change your hypothesis, and then just keep testing it. To me, that sounds like a sort of bias in a way, and all science is just having an open mind to change your bias according to the data. So in terms of that, I take a very unique point of view when it comes to my beliefs. I am a believer, but I am very skeptical of both creationism or intelligent design and evolution, because I see holes in both. So my question is in terms of physics, I see more evidence for intelligent design, and in terms of biology, I see more evidence for evolution. So with that in mind, can intelligent design and evolution coexist?
Yeah.
With that in mind.
What you just described is what Francis Collins believes. That's exactly what Francis Collins believes.
Yeah, and then my follow-up question is that how come it's not discussed in more of that manner?
I don't know. I wish it was. I'm here as an apologist for a theistic evolution. I don't know why there aren't more theistic evolutionists on the circuit. There should be.
And would it be far-fetched to say that evolution can be considered intelligent design in terms of the Big Bang? Everything was preconceived as a domino effect.
Well, so when you talk about the Big Bang, you're talking about cosmology. Evolutionary
Yes.
theory is biology. Those are two separate sciences. So you don't want to get
but
mixed
like
up.
in terms of a domino effect, one science, the origin of the universe, expands out into the origin of the Earth and then the origin of species in general. So intelligent design, how come can it be considered scientific to say everything was laid out from a starting point to put evolution in place, and that in terms can be considered intelligent design as well?
Well, that's not scientific. That's philosophical. That's Thomas Aquinas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you're treading Thomas Aquinas' argument right there.
So, sorry if I'm making this too long. So how come religion, science, and philosophy can't coexist? How come?
They can. They should.
Okay,
It's because of the fundamentalists that this is a problem. The fundamentalists, the higher source criticism came over, Darwinism came over, the church in America got freaked out, and it reacted in a very bad way. When have we ever seen the church do that before? A million times, right? And so they reacted in a very bad way, and what we have is that legacy of that very bad reaction. We can get past that. We can get over that, and I would encourage everybody to do so.
Do you have any input?
Pardon?
Do you have any input?
It's really hard. Certainly intelligent design can be utilized in the cosmological perspective. The whole science behind the Big Bang was resisted by many because of the potential philosophical conclusion of a beginning. And so, especially when you're dealing with cosmology, separating the philosophical from the scientific evidence is really tough to do. Many of the astronomers in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s were rejecting the Big Bang, not so much the rejecting it, but they clearly stated that they didn't like the philosophical implications of it. So you can't really divorce the two when you're talking about that level of origin. I don't know what other comment to make.
So, like, as...
Can we move on, please?
Yeah, I was just making sure that my question was answered. Intelligent design and evolution, can it coexist?
Potentially.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Bohlin, I'm primarily interested in systematic classification of life. I stated to you earlier that humans were a subset of apes in much the same way that lions are a subset of cats, iguanas are a subset of lizards, and ducks are a subset of birds. And you said that was a product of my bias. Now I'm determined to minimize or eliminate bias wherever possible. Can you explain to me how that was a product of my bias and how I can eliminate bias to properly classify humans?
I don't really recall, honestly, having that particular conversation with you, but how I would have responded to that, I would agree that those subsets exist. Where I might have a question is whether those subsets exist because of evolutionary relationship or because of a designer's choice of how he put organisms together.
Because you mentioned before that you would draw phylogenies for different organisms, which from a creationist perspective doesn't make much sense to me. Why would God make all of us in an evolutionary pattern? But are you saying now that you accept that humans are a member of the superfamily Hominoidea or the family Hominoidea?
Sure, I don't have any problem with that.
Okay,
It doesn't mean
so
they're evolutionary related, though.
But that humans are apes is the definition.
No, we're humans.
Well, that's the family Hominoidea. That means ape. And then the
It's
subfamily
hominoidea
Hominidae.
for reasons, not apes.
Right, and then Hominidae would be great apes.
Hmm.
Never mind.
Yeah, please.
Richard Dawkins has been brought up a couple times tonight, and one of his favorite topics is the lack of intelligence and intelligence design. It's issues like, why do we have the same tube we eat out of is the same tube we breathe out of? People die of choking deaths every day. It's poor design. That where our reproductive organs are is very close to where we poop and pee. Very silly design.
Worked pretty well, though, doesn't it?
Tell that to someone who's choked to death. And when you're also dealing with, the example that he uses, the most that I've always found fascinating, is, I hope I'm getting this right, the laryngeal nerve that connects our mouth to our brain, that helps us move our jaw, chew, talk, those things. For some reason that makes no sense at all, goes around our heart. Not just us, it happens to all mammals. And he demonstrated that with a giraffe, that went all the way down that long neck around the heart and all the way back up to the mouth. To me, that makes far more sense of being a flaw in evolution. Either that or it's a flaw in God. Which do you think it is?
Well, you mentioned a flaw. Could it be a flaw in God? Dawkins really defines that as an inevitable result of an evolutionary process from the past, that an evolutionary perspective makes sense as to why that nerve would be exactly like it is. I haven't researched this for quite some time, but I have looked into it in the past. It is a common accusation that he's made. And I know that there are articles at Evolution News, part of the Discovery Institute website, that has answered that particular objection. But you also have to understand that what you've made is a theological argument. It's not a scientific one.
I wasn't intending to make a scientific one.
You may not like the way God has designed something. It doesn't mean it wasn't designed.
Zach?
Well, so I'm sure you realize that you've damaged my case as well by bringing that up, right? So I'm promoting theistic evolution here, right? So I'm saying that God is in charge of all this. So you bring me bad design, and I'm telling you God's in charge of it. How dare he do that? Well, I think what it all comes down to is basically this is a version of the problem of evil argument, right? So is there a reason why God would allow these sorts of things to happen? And I think if theistic evolution is true, if evolution was the best way, or maybe not even the best way, but the way that God decreed in which life was to come into existence, then all that is accounted for in the end. And we can just sort of lump it in with the problem of evil. Sir?
Very short closing statements. Dr. Moore?
So it turns out, maybe you don't know this, but there is a boom in enthusiasm for the flat earth theory right now. Is anybody aware of this? Flat earth theory? On Facebook, there is something called the Flat Earth Society, which currently has over 72,000 people saying that they like the mission of the Flat Earth Society. Now, clearly, we live in a world where there are lots of different ideas being put forth. There are lots of different versions of science that are set forth to try to grasp our attention, try to motivate us to do certain things. It's not at all surprising in this world, especially post-Dover, where the scientific community, the legal community, and quite frankly, the culture of America has said no to intelligent design, that it still exists in minuscule form in various different organizations across the country, even here in Dallas-Fort Worth. My question to you, do we want to put forth a theory of design that turns God into a small, tiny creature working in some back laboratory on some weird little subcloning project to increase or decrease the amount of information in some target species genome? Is that really how we want to think about God? Is that really the way that the American church is going to keep children in the pews by focusing on intelligent design? We know that our children are leaving the church left and right. The church is shrinking. This is not helping. What may help is a different way of thinking about God compared to the way that we've been thinking about God for the past 100 years. Maybe we need something more than what the fundamentalists have given to us. Maybe we need a God so big that even somebody like me can believe in him again. Thank you.
Dr. Zachary Moore.
Well, Zach, I do have to commend you on being able to offer so many, what I would simply say sometimes sound like very outlandish statements for which there is no evidence for, and you stack them up in a way that I simply can't respond to all of them.
Dwayne Gish, does he do that?
Dwayne Gish is dead. Okay.
Reborn?
Some of these crickets are going on.
Yeah, cicadas.
All I'm simply going to reiterate is that Zach in his closing argument simply just made a theological argument. He just doesn't like the God he perceives to be existing if his version of intelligent design is accurate. Well, that's theological, that's philosophical. It has nothing to do with the scientific perspective. I came trying to answer the question, is intelligent design science? I believe it is. And when I look at the informational content of the genetic code, when I look at the processing of that informational code, when I look at the internal systems in a living cell and how they function with feedback systems and messaging within the body, within the organism, within the cell, back and forth, various kinds of motor proteins delivering various proteins from one side to the other with a very specified intent, things rarely go wrong. That plainly states to me that there is an intelligent cause to the origin of living things. And I'm simply asking you to look at it from that perspective and just look at the science, look at the empirical evidence. To me, that's convincing.
I would agree.
Thank you all.
All right.
Thank you, veterans. See everybody next month.